Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy oak doors of Queen Victoria's most private sanctuary, not a grand ballroom or throne room, but the intimate drawing room where she shed her crown for an hour each afternoon. You're settling into a chair that few outsiders ever occupied, watching steam curl from a porcelain teapot as the Queen of the British Empire reaches for something far simpler than you'd imagine. The year is 1870 and you are about to witness what Victoria actually consumed when the world wasn't watching, when protocol softened and personal preference reigned supreme. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why afternoon tea became Britain's most sacred ritual, or what a monarch craved when power and ceremony finally paused. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether it's your cozy bedroom in Toronto or a quiet evening in Sydney. Maybe share what you're sipping while you listen: coffee, chamomile, or perhaps your own afternoon tea. Your words fuel these journeys into history's quietest corners. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in Windsor Castle's East Wing, where afternoon light filters through lace curtains that cost more than most Londoners earned in a year. The room smells of beeswax polish and something warmer bergamot, perhaps, or the faint sweetness of vanilla. You notice how small this space feels compared to the castle's staterooms, how the furniture clusters in conversational intimacy rather than imperial grandeur. A fire crackles in the marble fireplace even though it's May, because Victoria always feels cold since Albert died 9 years ago. The Queen herself hasn't arrived yet, but you hear her footsteps in the corridor, that distinctive gait, slightly laboured now that she's 51 and carrying more weight than her physicians recommend. She enters without fanfare, and you're struck by how ordinary she looks in her black silk dress, unadorned except for a simple brooch containing Albert's hair. No crown, no sceptre, just a widow who happens to rule a quarter of the globe, settling into her favourite chair with a sigh that sounds like anyone's mother after a long day. "Tea," she says simply, and the words trigger a machinery of service you're only beginning to understand. Within moments, a servant appears silent as smoke, trained to move without creaking floorboards or rattling china, carrying a tray that holds Victoria's afternoon salvation. What's on that tray surprises you. You expected gilded excess, architectural pastries, perhaps peacock tongues or other Victorian absurdities you've read about in sensation novels. Instead, you see simplicity that borders on severity. The three-tiered stand holds items your own grandmother might serve: thin bread, a modest cake, small sandwiches cut into precise triangles. The teapot is beautiful but not ostentatious white porcelain with delicate blue flowers, a pattern Victoria inherited from her beloved Albert's German relatives. You watch her pour her own tea, waving away the servant's attempt to assist. This hour belongs to her, not to ceremony. "People think I feast like Henry VIII, Victoria says suddenly, and you realise she's speaking to you, acknowledging your presence in this impossible moment. Her voice carries that slight German accent she never quite lost, a reminder that she's as much Hanoverian as English. "They imagine I gorge on swan and gilded sugar sculptures. The truth," she gestures at the simple spread before her. "I prefer what comforts me, what reminds me of happier times." Her eyes grow distant, and you know she's thinking of Albert again. She's always thinking of Albert, even now, nearly a decade after typhoid stole him from her at 42. You notice how the afternoon light catches the steam rising from her cup, creating a momentary halo effect that feels almost holy. Historians still argue whether Victoria's devotion to afternoon tea stemmed from genuine enjoyment or from its association with Albert, who introduced her to several German tea customs that merged with British traditions in this very room. What's certain is that by 1870 this daily ritual has become inviolable. Ministers learn to schedule around it. Children know not to disturb her. The entire apparatus of empire pauses for an hour while Victoria sips and remembers and occasionally governs from this chair with a teacup balanced on her lap. The clock on the mantelpiece shows 4 o'clock exactly. You're learning that precision matters here. Tea at 4, not 4:05 or 3:55, but precisely when the clock tower outside strikes the hour. Victoria lifts a piece of bread and butter to her lips, chewing slowly, and you sense that this moment holds more significance than any state banquet. This is where the Queen becomes human, where the weight of crown and mourning dress lightens just enough for her to breathe. You're privileged to witness it, this most private of royal rituals, and you're beginning to understand why afternoon tea became the ceremony that defined an era. Not because of what Victoria ate, but because of what she needed, this daily proof that comfort still existed in a world that had taken her greatest love and left her alone on a throne too large for any single person. The bread crunches softly between her teeth, and somewhere outside the empire continues turning. You watch the minute hand on the mantelpiece clock approach the 12, and you notice something peculiar. Every servant in the corridor beyond has synchronized their movements to this moment. The under-butler checks his pocket watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. The maid carrying fresh linens pauses mid-step, waiting. Even the scullery boy hauling coal through the service passage freezes when the clock begins its chiming sequence. 4 sonorous bells ring through Windsor Castle, and the entire domestic machinery springs into choreographed motion. This isn't casual tea time. This is Victoria's sacred 4 o'clock rule. And you're about to understand why it became more inflexible than any act of Parliament. My mother never understood punctuality, Victoria tells you, spreading butter across her bread with geometric precision. She kept Italian hours dinner at 9, breakfast whenever she rose. Everything sliding and uncertain. You hear the disapproval in her voice. That peculiar Victorian judgment that equated tardiness with moral failure. Albert taught me that time is respect. When I say 4 o'clock, I mean 4 o'clock precisely. Not a fashionable quarter past, not whenever one feels ready. 4 o'clock. She takes a bite. And you realise this isn't merely preference, it's philosophy made edible. The rule emerged gradually during Victoria's marriage, when Albert's German efficiency collided with British aristocratic casualness. You imagine the early years at Buckingham Palace, when courtiers accustomed to Georgian laxity suddenly found themselves confronting Teutonic precision. Dinner at 8 meant 8, not 8:30. Morning meetings began when scheduled, not when participants finished their leisurely breakfasts. And afternoon tea, that peculiarly British invention that Albert embraced with characteristic thoroughness, became fixed at 4 o'clock with the immovability of celestial mechanics. The sun might deviate from its course, but Victoria's tea time would not. You notice the servants have internalized this precision into their bodies. The footman who enters carrying a fresh pot of hot water doesn't glance at any clock. He simply knows it's been exactly 8 minutes since Victoria took her first sip, which means the tea in her cup has cooled by approximately 3 degrees and requires refreshment. Another servant materializes with a small plate of lemon slices, arriving precisely when Victoria's hand drifts toward the sugar bowl, offering an alternative she sometimes accepts and sometimes declines. These people have learned to read time through Victoria's gestures, to anticipate her needs with chronometric accuracy. Do you know what happens when someone arrives late to my tea? Victoria asks. And there's a glint of something amusement sternness in her eyes. You shake your head, fascinated. Nothing happens. The door remains closed. Tea proceeds without them. I learned this from Albert, though I've perhaps taken it further than he intended. She pauses, considering. The Duke of Edinburgh arrived at 4:07 once. Once, he stood in the corridor for the entire hour, listening to us speak through the door, and has never been tardy since. Historians still argue whether Victoria's temporal rigidity stemmed from genuine efficiency principles or from her desperate attempt to maintain control over a life that had spiralled into chaos after Albert's death. Some suggest she clung to schedule because everything else felt uncertain: her health, her popularity, the stability of her vast empire. Others propose that punctuality represented her way of honouring Albert's memory, preserving his German exactitude like a sacred ritual. You watch her glance at Albert's empty chair, positioned precisely where he always sat, and you suspect the truth contains both explanations and something deeper still. The clock reads 4:14 now, and you've observed that Victoria's consumption follows its own internal timetable. First cup of tea between 4:01 and 4:06. While it's optimally hot but not scalding, bread and butter from 4:07 to 4:15, eaten in small bites that allow conversation and digestion. The cake, you haven't seen it yet, but you know its comings will appear between 4:20 and 4:30. This internal structure exists nowhere in writing, yet every servant knows it, passed down through whispered training sessions and careful observation. Time is the only democracy, Victoria muses, and you're startled by the philosophical turn. It passes equally for queen and coal miner, for genius and fool. The difference lies in how we choose to spend it. She sips her tea, and you notice her eyes have softened slightly. Albert believed that respecting time meant respecting life itself. Every wasted minute was a small death. He'd say, rather Germanic of him. Don't you think? There's affection in her voice now. That particular tenderness she reserves for memories of her dead husband. You're beginning to understand that the 4 o'clock rule extends beyond mere punctuality into something resembling secular religion. In a reign marked by wars, political upheavals, and personal tragedies, this daily ceremony provided Victoria with the one thing monarchs rarely possess: predictability. The empire might convulse, Parliament might quarrel, her children might disappoint her with their romantic choices. But at 4 o'clock every afternoon, tea would be served in this room with the same items arranged in the same order at the same temperature. It's control disguised as etiquette. Grief management masquerading as good manners. The servants continue their silent ballet around you. One removes Victoria's empty bread plate while simultaneously placing a fresh napkin beside her right hand. Another adjusts the fire, adding exactly 2 pieces of coal without creating any sound that might disturb the Queen's thoughts. A third servant you didn't even see her enter refreshes the water in the small vase holding a single white rose, Albert's favourite flower. Everything happens on schedule, in sequence, with a mechanical precision of Swiss watchmaking. My physicians tell me I should relax my routines, Victoria says with a slight smile. They suggest spontaneity might improve my digestion and mood. Can you imagine? She laughs, a surprisingly girlish sound from this formidable woman. Spontaneity is what killed Albert. He insisted on inspecting these drafty barracks in the rain, catching his death because some military schedule had been arranged. No, thank you. I'll keep my routines. You glance at the clock again, 4:23. Right on schedule. A servant appears with a covered dish. The Dundee cake is about to make its entrance, and you sense that this moment, like all moments in Victoria's tea time, has been timed with astronomical precision. The 4 o'clock rule isn't just about when tea begins, it's about the entire choreographed hour that follows. every element appearing at its appointed moment like actors in a play that's been running for decades. Outside the windows, you see the sun beginning its descent toward the western gardens. In 6 minutes, Victoria will take her first bite of cake. In 37 minutes, she'll dismiss her servants and sit alone with her memories and her cooling tea. But right now, in this precisely orchestrated moment, the Queen of the British Empire is exactly where she wants to be, doing exactly what she planned to do, at exactly 4:23 on a May afternoon. Time bends to no monarch, but Victoria has learned to dance within its boundaries with the grace of someone who's lost too much to tolerate further unpredictability. The clock ticks forward, implacable and comforting in its regularity. You watch Victoria reach for what appears to be the simplest item on her 3-tiered stand, a thin slice of white bread spread with pale butter, and you're confused by its prominence. This plain offering occupies the entire bottom tier, arranged in neat triangles that catch the afternoon light like edible geometry. No herbs garnish it, no exotic spreads enhance it, just bread and butter, the kind of fare a farmer's wife might serve. Yet here it sits at the centre of a queen's most private meal. Victoria catches your expression and smiles knowingly. You expected something grander, she says, and it's not a question. Lady Palmerston served me tea once, Victoria continues, lifting a triangle to examine it as though it contained secrets. The year Albert died, when I finally accepted a social invitation. Her table groaned with towers of pastries, each one sculpted into flowers and birds, gilded with actual gold leaf, stuffed with creams from France and preserves from Italy. 73 different items. I counted. 73. She takes a small bite, chewing thoughtfully. I ate 2 pieces of bread and butter and left. She never invited me again. The bread itself tells a story you're only beginning to decipher. It's cut precisely 1/4 inch thick, any thinner, and it tears when buttered. Any thicker, and Victoria considers it vulgar. The crust had been removed by a servant using a silver knife sharpened specifically for this purpose, leaving edges so clean they might have been drawn with a ruler. You notice the butter has been softened to exactly room temperature, spreadable without tearing the delicate crumb structure, but not so warm it appears oily. These details matter in ways that seem absurd until you remember that Victoria's preferences become national trends, that what pleases the Queen's palate today will appear in middle-class homes across England tomorrow. My grandmother, Queen Charlotte, ate bread and butter every afternoon of her life, Victoria tells you, and suddenly this simple food carries genealogical weight. She learned it from her German relatives, the same relatives who gave me Albert. Actually, everything circles back to Germany, doesn't it? There's no bitterness in her voice, just observation. The British aristocracy mocked her for it initially, called it peasant food, but she persisted, and eventually simplicity became fashionable, or at least acceptably royal. You're learning that Victoria's preference for plain bread and butter shocked her contemporaries precisely because it rejected the ornate excess that defined Victorian entertaining. This was an era when dinner parties featured dozen-course meals, when every surface required decoration, when restraint suggested poverty rather than taste. Yet here sat the Empire's sovereign, choosing the culinary equivalent of silence in a world that screamed for attention. Historians still argue whether this represented genuine preference or calculated political positioning, Victoria's way of distinguishing herself from the gluttonous Georgian monarchs who preceded her. The butter itself comes from Victoria's own dairy at Windsor, churned that morning from milk produced by Jersey cows she personally selected. You watch her spread it with the concentration of someone performing a meaningful ritual, edge to edge, corner to corner, achieving even coverage that would satisfy a mathematician. Albert taught me this, she says quietly. How to butter bread properly. On our honeymoon at Windsor, I was spreading it carelessly, leaving gaps. He took the knife from my hand and showed me gently, always so gently, how to achieve uniform distribution. "My dear," he said, "if something is worth doing, it's worth doing correctly, even buttering bread." Her eyes glistened slightly, and you realise you're witnessing grief expressed through food preparation. The bread arrives from a specific London bakery that's been supplying the royal household since 1842, the year after Victoria married Albert. The recipe hasn't changed in 28 years. White flour, water, salt, yeast, and a secret ingredient that the baker's family refuses to disclose even to the Queen. Victoria doesn't mind the secrecy. She appreciates constancy over knowledge. The comfort of knowing that today's bread tastes identical to yesterday's and will match tomorrow's, in a life defined by loss and change. This bland consistency offers its own form of luxury. "Do you know what the French ambassador said when I served him bread and butter?" Victoria asks, and there's mischief in her tone now. He examined it, turning the plate as though it might reveal hidden complexity. Then he asked my footman in French, assuming I wouldn't understand, whether the royal kitchen was experiencing financial difficulties. "Can you imagine?" She laughs, genuinely delighted by the memory. I replied to him in perfect French that no, our finances were quite sound, and that perhaps French cuisine had become so elaborate precisely because it started from inferior ingredients. He never mentioned it again. You notice that Victoria eats exactly 4 pieces of bread and butter during her tea time, never 3, never 5, always 4. This precision extends beyond mere habit into something resembling superstition, though she'd never admit it. 4 pieces because Albert ate 4. 4 pieces because the number feels complete. 4 pieces because changing now would feel like betrayal, would acknowledge that life continues evolving even when you desperately want it to freeze. The simplicity of bread and butter also serves practical purposes you hadn't considered. It doesn't stain black mourning silk if dropped. It doesn't require elaborate utensils or careful navigation like pastries do. It can be eaten while reading dispatches or signing documents, which Victoria often does during her tea time, despite her stated preference for relaxation. The food adapts to her needs rather than demanding her attention, which perfectly suits a woman juggling empire and grief in equal measure. "My physician, Dr. Jenner, insists I should eat more vegetables," Victoria mentions, selecting her 3rd triangle of bread. "He brings me pamphlets about nutrition and digestion, charts showing what I should consume. I listen politely and ignore him completely. At 51, I've earned the right to eat what brings me comfort rather than what promises optimal health. Besides, I've outlived 3 of my physicians while maintaining my bread and butter habit. Perhaps they should consider adopting my diet." You're struck by how this plain food has become Victoria's rebellion against the excess her position demands. She cannot choose simplicity in governance, in fashion. In public appearances, every aspect of her public life requires grandeur that exhausts her. But here, in this private hour, she can exercise the one privilege aristocracy rarely affords: the privilege of plainness. The bread and butter represent freedom disguised as frugality, power expressed through restraint. The 4th piece disappears, and you notice Victoria's shoulders have relaxed slightly. The tension that marked her entrance easing with familiar flavours and textures. Around you, servants maintain their vigilant silence, ready to refresh the bread supply, though they know she never requests more than 4 pieces. The predictability comforts everyone. Victoria knows what she'll eat. Servants know what to prepare, and the entire ritual unfolds with the ease of water finding its predetermined course, outside. England's aristocracy continues serving elaborate teas with architectural pastries and imported delicacies, each household trying to outdo the next in culinary creativity. But here at Windsor, the Queen of the British Empire contentedly eats bread and butter cut into triangles, honouring German tradition and dead husband and personal preference all in 4 simple pieces that somehow contain entire philosophies about power, grief, and the radical courage required to choose simplicity in a world demanding spectacle. The servant lifts a silver dome from the middle tier of the stand, and you smell it before you see it: dark fruit, whiskey, almonds, and something else. Something that makes Victoria's entire demeanour shift. A Dundee cake sits before you, its top decorated with concentric circles of blanched almonds arranged with geometric precision. This isn't just dessert. You're looking at edible homesickness, at grief transformed into flour and butter, at 500 miles of Scottish longing compressed into 8 inches of dense, dark cake that arrives at Windsor every single week without fail. From Keeler's Bakery in Dundee, Victoria says, and her voice carries an accent that wasn't there moments ago, something softer, more Highland, as though speaking of Scotland unlocks a different version of herself. They've been sending this cake every Monday for 9 years now. Before that, Albert and I would bring dozens of them back whenever we visited Balmoral. He adored this cake, said it tasted like the Highlands condensed into something you could hold in your hand. She cuts a thin slice, and you notice her hands trembling slightly, though whether from emotion or the early tremors that will plague her later years, you cannot tell. The Dundee cake tradition began during Victoria and Albert's first visit to Scotland in 1842, when they were still newlyweds, discovering each other's preferences and building the private world that would sustain them through decades of public duty. A local baker presented them with this regional specialty, not the heavy fruit cake drowning in alcohol that characterised English Christmas fare, but something lighter, more refined, studded with sultanas and currants and crowned with those distinctive almonds. Albert took one bite and declared it perfection. Victoria, watching her husband's face light up with pleasure, made a mental note that would eventually become a weekly ritual spanning continents. "Do you see how the almonds spiral outward from the centre?" Victoria asks, tracing the pattern with her finger. The baker insists on this arrangement, says it represents the spreading influence of good things from a central point. Rather philosophical for a Scottish tradesman, but I appreciate the metaphor. She takes a small bite, closing her eyes briefly, and you witness something private, the Queen disappearing, leaving only a woman remembering happier times in a castle that felt more like home than any London palace ever could. The cake travels 500 miles every week, wrapped in waxed paper and packed in a wooden box lined with straw. A dedicated messenger carries it on the overnight train from Dundee to London, then by carriage to Windsor, arriving precisely at 3 o'clock every Monday afternoon so it can rest and settle before Tuesday's tea time. This single cake costs more to transport than most Scottish families earn in a month, yet Victoria considers it essential rather than extravagant. Some expenses transcend economics into the realm of emotional necessity. Historians still argue whether Victoria's devotion to Dundee cake stemmed from genuine affection for the flavour or from its association with Balmoral, the Scottish estate where she and Albert experienced their most relaxed, authentic years together. The castle in the Highlands represented escape from London's suffocating protocol, a place where Victoria could walk freely, where Albert could manage the estate like a German gentleman farmer, where their children could run wild in ways impossible at Windsor or Buckingham Palace. The cake carried all those memories in its dense crumb, all that freedom and joy preserved in sugar and spice. The recipe is supposedly secret, Victoria continues, selecting another small piece. though I suspect half of Scotland knows it by now. Sultanas, currants, candied peel, almonds, flour, butter, eggs, and whiskey, Scotch whiskey specifically. None of that Irish business. The proportions matter enormously. Too much fruit and it becomes cloyingly sweet. Too little and you're just eating almond top butter cake. Keeler's has perfected the balance, though I'll admit I've never attempted to recreate it myself. Some things should remain mysteries, preserved by expertise rather than royal appropriation. You notice that Victoria eats her Dundee cake differently than her bread and butter. The bread disappeared efficiently, fuel consumed without ceremony. But the cake receives contemplation, each bite separated by pauses where she seems to travel elsewhere, mentally probably to Balmoral, to evenings when she and Albert would sit by the fire while Highland rain drummed against the windows, sharing cake and conversation in German, their private language that excluded the English court and allowed them to simply be a married couple rather than monarch and consort. The cake itself represents Scottish identity in ways that make Victoria's affection for it politically complex. She reigns over a united kingdom where Scottish nationalism simmers beneath surface harmony, where Highland culture still recovers from brutal suppression within living memory, and yet here's the English Queen, or rather, the Hanoverian German Queen of England, declaring her love for Scotland through weekly cake deliveries, wearing tartan at every opportunity, building a fantasy Highland castle, and learning Gaelic phrases that make her Scottish subjects simultaneously proud and suspicious. Food becomes diplomacy. Dessert transforms into political statement. My Scottish ministers appreciate my affection for Dundee cake, Victoria mentions, as though reading your thoughts, though I suspect some view it as performance rather than genuine preference. They're wrong, of course. I loved Scotland before it was politically convenient, and I'll continue loving it after fashion moves elsewhere. Albert and I chose Balmoral because it felt right, because the air was clear and the people honest and the landscape reminded him of German forests he'd known as a boy. The cake simply became part of that love, edible proof that good things can emerge from cold northern places that southern sophisticates dismiss as provincial. The almonds on top gleam in the firelight, and you realise they've been toasted to exact specifications, golden but not brown, crisp but not hard, each one identical to its neighbours in that way that suggests obsessive quality control. Keeler's Bakery understands that they're not just supplying cake to Windsor, they're maintaining a grief ritual, preserving memories of a dead prince through confectionery consistency. The pressure must be enormous, yet they've never failed to deliver in 9 years, never sent a cake that arrived damaged or stale or improperly decorated. After Albert died, Victoria says quietly, and you notice she always speaks of him dying, never of his death, as though the passive construction somehow softens the loss. I couldn't eat for weeks. Everything tasted like ashes or nothing at all. But someone I don't remember who brought me Dundee cake about a month after the funeral. I took one bite and burst into tears because it tasted exactly as it should, exactly as it had when Albert was alive. The world had ended, but the cake remained unchanged, and somehow that helped. Proof that some things survive even catastrophic loss. You watch her take another bite, and you're beginning to understand that this weekly cake delivery represents more than homesickness or culinary preference. It's Victoria's way of keeping Albert present, of maintaining continuity with her happiest years, of refusing to let grief erase all traces of joy. Every Monday, the cake arrives like a letter from the past, reminding her that she once laughed freely, once walked Scottish hillsides without the weight of widowhood pressing on her shoulders, once shared simple pleasures with a man who loved her not because she was queen, but because she was Victoria. The slice on her plate diminishes slowly, and you notice that Victoria never finishes an entire piece during one tea time. She'll eat half today, half tomorrow, stretching the experience across multiple days as though rationing happiness, making it last. The cake tin sits beside the tea stand, its tartan-patterned exterior a small act of identity declaration in a room full of English furniture and continental porcelain. Inside, the remaining cake waits, dense with fruit and history and longing for places and people that distance and death have placed beyond reach. Next Monday, Victoria says. Another will arrive. The week after that. Another. Until I die, I suppose. And then the orders will finally stop. She pauses, considering. I've left instructions that Keelers should continue receiving payment for one final year after my death. One last year of Monday cakes that no one will eat. Arriving at an empty castle, honouring a tradition that outlives its purpose. Wasteful, perhaps. But some rituals deserve proper endings rather than abrupt cessation. Outside, Scotland continues to exist in 500 miles north, cold and rainy and beautiful, in ways that London will never understand. But here in Windsor, in this warm room smelling of tea and almonds and memory, Victoria consumes her weekly piece of homeland and husband, finding comfort in consistency, in flavours that refuse to change despite everything else transforming around her. The Dundee cake endures, travelling its long journey every week, carrying love and loss in equal measure, proving that sometimes the most powerful things we eat aren't the most elaborate but the most faithful. You notice a servant approaching with a silver platter, and on it rest perfect little triangles and rectangles of sandwich, each one smaller than your palm, each one engineered with precision that would impress a military tactician. These are Victoria's finger sandwiches, and you are about to learn that there are apparent simplicity masks elaborate protocol, kitchen hierarchies, and geometric obsessions that transform simple bread and filling into edible architecture. Victoria gestures toward them with one hand, and you see that her fingers are indeed small, delicate, the kind of hands that make these miniature sandwiches proportionate rather than absurdly tiny. Cucumber, salmon, and egg, Victoria announces, pointing to each variety in turn. Always these three, always in this order on the plate, always cut according to specifications that my head cook guards more jealously than state secrets. She selects a cucumber sandwich, holding it between thumb and forefinger, and you notice how the bread compression creates structural integrity. These sandwiches won't fall apart mid-bite, won't deposit filling onto black silk morning dresses, won't create the social catastrophe of visible eating difficulties. Everything about them suggests control, predictability, and the domestication of nature's chaos into orderly rectangles. The cucumber sandwiches occupy the geometric centre of protocol most traditional, most British, most symbolic of the class distinctions that tea time reinforces. You watch Victoria bite into one, and you're struck by its thinness. The cucumber has been sliced so fine you can nearly see through it, perhaps 1/16 of an inch, translucent as parchment. The bread surrounding it is equally minimal, creating a sandwich that's more concept than substance, more symbol than sustenance. It tastes primarily of butter, the good Windsor dairy butter, with cucumber providing texture and a whisper of freshness rather than assertive flavour. The cucumber sandwiches must be made no more than 20 minutes before serving, Victoria explains between bites. Any earlier and the moisture from the cucumber begins degrading the bread. Any later and the kitchen falls behind schedule. My cook, Mrs. Farley, has dismissed 3 assistant cooks for failing to master the timing. She's quite tyrannical about it, actually. It reminds me of Albert in that regard, understanding that precision in small things creates excellence in larger ones. There's approval in her voice, that Victorian conviction that character reveals itself through attention to detail. The bread for these sandwiches comes from the same London bakery that supplies Victoria's bread and butter, but it's cut even thinner, perhaps 1/8 of an inch per slice, creating a foundation that's structurally sound yet nearly transparent. The crusts are removed using a different knife than the one employed for bread and butter service. This one with a longer blade that permits single, smooth cuts rather than soaring motions that might compress or tear the delicate crumb. The cut edges must be perfectly straight, forming 90-degree angles at each corner, because Victoria notices imperfection, and imperfection suggests slovenliness, which suggests moral failing, which cannot be tolerated even in sandwich geometry. Historians still argue whether the cucumber sandwich's association with upper-class British tea time emerged because cucumbers were expensive hothouse vegetables unavailable to common people, or because their bland flavour perfectly suited Victorian preferences for restrained, non-assertive foods that wouldn't excite dangerous passions or digestive disturbances. You watch Victoria eat her second cucumber sandwich and suspect the truth involves both economics and philosophy. The sandwich announces class status while simultaneously embodying the emotional restraint that defined respectable Victorian life. The salmon sandwiches introduce colour and complexity, pale pink fish against white bread and butter, a visual departure from cucumber's monochromatic minimalism. The salmon arrives fresh from Scotland, another echo of Balmoral and Highland happiness, transported on ice during summer months and smoked during winter when fresh fish won't survive the journey. It's sliced thin as the cucumber, layered with more butter because salmon's natural oils require less fat for palatability, and seasoned with nothing except a microscopic amount of white pepper that Victoria can detect but most people cannot. Albert preferred the salmon sandwiches, Victoria says. And of course he did. Of course this detail matters. Of course every element of tea time connects somehow to her dead husband. He'd eat 4 or 5 of them, which Mrs. Farley found gratifying. She always made extra salmon sandwiches on days when Albert took tea with me, knowing he'd consume them with genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation. After he died, she continued making the same quantity for months before I finally told her to reduce the amount. We were wasting quite a lot of salmon, feeding it to the dogs rather than admit Albert wouldn't be eating it. You noticed the servants who prepared these sandwiches wore white gloves during the entire process. Not the formal gloves footmen wear while serving, but thin cotton gloves specifically for food preparation, changed 3 times during the sandwich making process to ensure no hand oils or ambient dirt contaminate these delicate offerings. The gloves themselves cost more than most Londoners spend on food in a week, yet they're considered essential rather than extravagant, necessary components of maintaining standards that separate Windsor Castle from common households where people touch food with bare hands like animals. The egg sandwiches complete the trinity. Golden yellow filling visible through bread that's been somehow rendered even thinner than the cucumber and salmon foundations. The eggs are hard-boiled that morning, cooled immediately in ice water to prevent that greenish ring that forms around the yolk when cooking continues after removal from heat, then pressed through a fine sieve to create texture resembling paste rather than chunks. Mixed with butter, a hint of mustard powder so subtle you question whether it's actually present, and salt from Malden. The resulting filling spreads with architectural smoothness, filling every microscopic gap in the bread's crumb structure. Egg sandwiches are distinctly English, Victoria observes, selecting one with evident pleasure. The Germans don't understand them. The French mock them. But we English know that a properly made egg sandwich represents civilization's triumph over chaos. You're taking something that emerges warm and fragile from a chicken, subjecting it to heat and cold and mechanical processing, then reconstructing it into something that can be held in your hand and consumed without utensils. Rather miraculous when you think about it. The geometric rules governing these sandwiches could fill a small book. Cucumber sandwiches must be cut into rectangles measuring exactly 2 inches by 1 inch rectangles, not squares, because squares suggest instability while rectangles imply motion and grace. Salmon sandwiches are cut into triangles with 2-inch sides, the diagonal cut exposing the pretty pink filling and creating visual interest that monochromatic cucumber cannot provide. Egg sandwiches receive square cuts, 1 1/2 inches per side, because eggs' density requires less surface area per portion and squares' stability suits the heavier filling. You watch Victoria consume one of each variety, working through them with the systematic approach she applies to state documents and family correspondence. She doesn't mix them randomly or save favourites for last that would suggest disorder, lack of planning, surrender to impulse rather than reason. Instead, she proceeds cucumber salmon egg, a pattern as reliable as the tides, and probably just as influenced by celestial mechanics and human ritual working in unknowable combination. Mrs. Farley insists the sandwiches must be arranged on the platter in a specific pattern Nuncier, Victoria continues, and you can hear both amusement and approval in her voice. Cucumber forming the outer ring, salmon in a middle ring, egg in the centre. She says it creates visual harmony that settles the stomach before eating even begins. I'm not sure I believe that, but I appreciate her commitment to aesthetic principles. Albert would have liked her very much. The sandwich platter slowly empties as tea time progresses, and you notice that Victoria never takes the last sandwich of any variety. This isn't consideration of others, she's alone except for silent servants, but rather superstition or etiquette so deeply ingrained it functions as instinct. Taking the last of anything suggests greed, suggests need, suggests the desperation of someone who doesn't know when the next meal might arrive. Victoria has never experienced hunger, never faced empty cupboards. Yet she's been trained since childhood that leaving remnants demonstrates breeding, proves you're not ruled by appetite, announces your freedom from basic needs that govern common people. Around you, servants collect the empty platter and prepare to bring whatever comes next in this carefully orchestrated meal. But for now, in this moment between courses, Victoria sits with hands folded in her lap, cucumber and salmon and egg settling comfortably in her stomach. Another small portion of her daily ritual completed according to specifications that connect her to husband and homeland and the elaborate social codes that make Victorian England simultaneously magnificent and absurd. The finger sandwiches have served their purpose, not filling her, not nourishing her in any significant way, but rather performing the ritual dance that transforms eating from biological necessity into social sacrament, from mere consumption into ceremony worth preserving across decades and continents and all the losses that time inflicts on even queens. You watch Victoria lift the teapot, simple white porcelain with those delicate blue flowers, and pour herself a second cup. And you realise you've been so focused on what she eats that you've neglected what she drinks, the liquid foundation supporting this entire ritual. The tea itself holds mysteries you're only beginning to understand. And as steam curls upward, carrying complex aromatic notes, Victoria settles back in her chair with the expression of someone about to share secrets that most of her subjects will never learn. People assume I drink whatever tea arrives at the palace, she says, watching the amber liquid fill her cup. They're wrong. This blend was created specifically for me, adjusted and readjusted over 15 years until it achieved perfection. The story begins in 1855 during the Crimean War, when traditional tea trade routes faced disruption and Victoria's usual Chinese black tea became unreliable. Her tea merchant, a man named Fortnum, who'd been supplying the royal household since her coronation, approached her with a proposal: what if they blended Chinese tea with the newer Indian, Assam tea, that British colonisation had made available. Chinese tea offered complexity and subtlety, while Assam contributed strength and body. Together, properly proportioned, they might create something superior to either component alone. Victoria, who'd been raised on Chinese tea and found Assam too aggressive when consumed pure, agreed to experimentation. "We spent months testing ratios," Victoria recalls, and you detect genuine enthusiasm in her voice, the excitement of someone who discovered unexpected interest in an arcane subject. 70% Chinese to 30% Assam produced pleasant but forgettable tea. 60-40 created something too muscular, overwhelming delicate pastries and bread. 50-50 was theoretically elegant but practically unbalanced. The two varieties fought each other rather than harmonizing. We finally settled on 65% Chinese black tea from Fujian province, 35% Assam from the Brahmaputra Valley, with a secret final component that Fortnum refuses to reveal even to me. The secret ingredient haunts Victoria with gentle frustration. She's the queen of the British Empire, ruler of millions, yet her tea merchant withholds one piece of information from her. "I've attempted to identify it," she admits, swirling her cup as though the motion might reveal hidden truths. "Sometimes I detect bergamot. Other times perhaps jasmine or rose petals. Once I was convinced it was vanilla, but Fortnum smiled mysteriously and said nothing. Albert found my investigative efforts amusing. He'd blindfold me and present me with various teas, asking me to identify mine among decoys. I never could with certainty. The secret component remains elusive, which I suppose adds to the pleasure." Historians still argue whether the royal blend, as Victoria's personal tea mixture came to be known, truly contained a secret ingredient, or whether Fortnum simply encouraged this belief to elevate a relatively straightforward blend into something mythologically complex. What's certain is that by 1870, Victoria's tea had become fashionable among those wealthy enough to afford specialty blends, and several London merchants offered products claiming to replicate the royal formula, none of which satisfied Victoria when she tested them anonymously through trusted servants. You watch her sip, and you notice the specific technique. She doesn't slurp or gulp, doesn't blow on hot liquid to cool it, doesn't add milk or sugar yet, just drinks it straight for several sips to appreciate the pure flavour before introducing modifications. "The first sips are always black," she explains. "Albert taught me this as well, everything useful I know. I learned from Albert. He said you cannot judge tea's true character if you immediately drown it in milk and sugar. That would be like meeting someone while they're wearing a mask. You must encounter tea honestly first. Accept its bitterness and astringency. Understand what you're working with before attempting improvements. The tea's temperature matters enormously. Too hot and it scalds delicate tissues, making appreciation impossible. Too cool and volatile aromatic compounds have dissipated, leaving only base notes without the complexity that makes good tea interesting. Victoria's tea arrives at approximately 160 degrees Fahrenheit, the precise temperature that allows immediate drinking without discomfort while preserving maximum flavour. Achieving this requires timing the water's boil, calculating the teapot's thermal mass, and accounting for heat loss during the 30-second journey from kitchen to drawing room. Misses. Farley has written equations, actual mathematical formulas governing these variables, and she's dismissed servants who couldn't execute the calculations reliably. Chinese tea alone is too delicate for afternoon consumption, Victoria continues. and you're receiving a masterclass in tea philosophy from the empire's foremost authority. It suits morning perfectly, when your palate is fresh and sensitive. But by 4 o'clock you've been speaking all day. Your mouth has been dried by conversation, and possibly tobacco smoke from ministers who refuse to acknowledge that their habit disgusts me. You need tea with strength, with body, something that can cut through afternoon fatigue and restore vitality. That's where the Assam component becomes essential. It provides backbone, structural integrity that prevents the blend from being overwhelmed by butter or cake. The tea itself represents Victoria's vast empire. In liquid form, Chinese leaves travelled 6,000 miles by ship. Assam leaves came 3,000 miles from colonial plantations, and they met in London, blending houses where expert tasters combined products from opposite sides of the world into something that would be poured in Windsor Castle. The global machinery required to deliver this afternoon comfort staggers the imagination farmers. Pickers, processors, shippers, merchants, tasters, and finally servants, all labouring to ensure Victoria's cup contains exactly what she expects. You notice she's added milk now, pouring from a small silver pitcher that's been warmed slightly, not hot, just room temperature rather than refrigerator cold, because cold milk shocks the tea and creates separation rather than emulsion. The milk comes from the same Jersey cows that provide her butter, cream-rich and faintly yellow, turning the amber tea into a pale caramel shade that Victoria examines critically before accepting with a small nod. The milk ratio is approximately 1 part milk to 4 parts tea, though Victoria adjusts based on the specific day's brewing strength and her mood's requirements. "I tried lemon once," Victoria says with a slight grimace. "Russian style. Very fashionable during the war years when anything associated with our allies became popular. Dreadful. Absolutely dreadful." The citric acid clashed with the Assam's tannins, creating a bitter metallic taste that lingered for hours. I offended the Russian ambassador by abandoning my cup half-finished, but I couldn't force myself to continue. Some diplomatic incidents are worth causing if they mean avoiding culinary suffering. The teapot itself holds exactly 3 cups worth of tea. Victoria's first cup at 4:05, her second at 4:25, her third at 4:45. By the third cup, the tea has cooled slightly and the leaves have released more tannins, creating a stronger, slightly more astringent brew that Victoria claims helps with digestion. Whether this is scientifically valid or personal mythology matters less than her belief in it. Her conviction that this progression from smooth to strong aids her body's processing of bread and butter and cake and sandwiches. "My physicians wanted me to drink coffee," Victoria mentions with evident disdain. "They claimed it was more healthful, better for the heart and digestion. I informed them that I was not French, not German, and certainly not American, and that tea had sustained the British Empire quite adequately without medical interference. They didn't raise the subject again." They're still beneath her words. That reminder that despite the domestic intimacy of tea time, you're still conversing with someone who rules a quarter of the globe and doesn't tolerate contradiction about her beverage choices. You watch her drain her second cup, and the servant immediately appears to clear it, to refresh her napkin, to ensure the teapot remains optimally warm beneath its quilted cosy. The tea ritual continues its gentle rhythm, liquid punctuation between solid foods, warm comfort flowing into Victoria's body and carrying with it all the meanings she's assigned, connection to Albert, who taught her to appreciate it properly, connection to her vast empire whose products create it, connection to British identity that defines itself partly through this beverage that actually originated in China. and came to England through Portuguese and Dutch traders before being enthusiastically adopted as somehow quintessentially British. "When I die," Victoria says suddenly, and you're startled by the morbid turn, "I want my tea merchant to continue blending this mixture for 1 year, available to anyone who wishes to purchase it. 1 final year of royal blend being truly royal, actually consumed by the queen it was created for, before it becomes just another commercial product with royal associations. Everything eventually becomes commodity, but perhaps we can delay it slightly." She pours her third cup. And you understand that you're watching someone who thinks about legacy constantly, who knows that everything she touches will be preserved, commercialized, mythologized beyond recognition. The third cup steams gently before her, darker than the first two, stronger, more bitter, exactly as she prefers it at this stage of tea time. Outside, the British Empire continues expanding, contracting, evolving in ways that will eventually make afternoon tea seem quaintly obsolete. But here, now, in this moment, Victoria's tea remains perfectly blended, optimally warm, precisely what she needs it to be: comfort and ceremony and chemistry, combining in a porcelain cup that costs more than most people earn in months, filled with liquid that travelled continents to arrive here, in this room, at this moment, in this woman's hands. You watch Victoria's hand hover over a small silver bowl filled with white cubes, each one precisely cut, each one waiting to sweeten the third cup of tea that sits before her. This moment, the sugar cube controversy, as you'll come to understand, it represents more than simple preference. It's become a battleground where Victoria's personal pleasure collides with medical opinion, where her physicians wage quiet war against her sweetness habits, where body and desire and mortality intersect over something as mundane as crystallized sucrose. She selects 2 cubes with decisive fingers, dropping them into her tea with soft plinking sounds, and you sense immediately that this action carries weight beyond its apparent simplicity. "Doctor, Jenna believes I consume too much sugar," Victoria says, stirring her tea in precise clockwise circles. "He's written me letters, actual formal letters, as though I'm a patient who requires written documentation rather than a queen who employs him. He claims my weight gain correlates directly with my sugar consumption, that if I'd simply eliminate these 2 cubes from my afternoon tea, I'd lose a stone within 6 months. I've informed him that I've already lost what matters most, and that a stone of weight seems trivial by comparison." Her voice carries defiance, but underneath you detect defensiveness, awareness that perhaps the doctor speaks uncomfortable truth. The sugar itself arrives from multiple sources within Victoria's empire: Jamaican cane sugar, refined in London into these perfect cubes that represent industrial achievement and colonial extraction in equal measure. Each cube measures approximately ½ an inch per side, weighing about 4 grams, containing roughly 16 calories. 2 cubes mean 32 calories, which seems negligible until you calculate that Victoria has consumed this amount daily for decades, adding up to thousands of cups sweetened with hundreds of thousands of calories that have indeed contributed to the weight that troubles her physicians and, though she won't admit it, troubles her as well. "I used to take 3 cubes, Victoria admits, and there's something confessional in her tone now. Albert preferred his tea less sweet, only 1 cube, and he'd tease me gently about my excessive sweetness requirement. 'My dear,' he'd say, 'you're sweet enough already without adding sugar.' Charming, but also pointed he worried about my health even then, though I was much slimmer in those days. After he died, I briefly increased to 4 cubes, seeking comfort in sweetness since nothing else comforted me. But doctor, Jenna staged something resembling an intervention, actually removing the sugar bowl from my tea service one afternoon. I was furious. Absolutely furious. We compromised at 2 cubes, and I've maintained that amount for 9 years now. Historians still argue whether Victoria's weight gains. She's added approximately 40 pounds since Albert's death, transforming from the relatively slender woman of her early reign into the formidable matron recognisable from later photographs stemmed primarily from sugar consumption, from reduced physical activity as grief limited her movement, from simple aging and metabolic changes, or from some combination of all three. What's certain is that her physicians focused obsessively on her sugar intake, treating those 2 afternoon cubes as though they alone determined her body's destiny, ignoring the bread and butter and cake and sandwiches that contributed far more calories than 32 from sugar cubes. You watch the cubes dissolve, turning the milky tea slightly cloudy as they release their sweetness. Victoria takes her first sip of sweetened tea, and something in her face softens, not happiness exactly, but relief, the easing of tension that comes from satisfying a craving that's been building since the unsweetened sips that began this tea time. "Sugar is pleasure without apology," she says quietly. "Everything else in my life requires justification, requires explanation, requires consideration of how it affects empire or family or public perception. But these 2 cubes," she holds one between thumb and forefinger before dropping it into her cup. "These are mine. These answer to no one." The controversy around Victoria's sugar consumption reflects broader Victorian anxieties about female appetite, about bodily control, about the moral implications of visible desire. A queen who took sugar demonstrated she possessed wants, needs, cravings, all things that made male advisors and physicians uncomfortable because they suggested Victoria was human rather than symbolic, flesh rather than marble. The sugar cubes became metonymic for all desires that proper Victorian women were supposed to sublimate or hide, that Victoria consumed them publicly, in front of servants and occasionally ministers, with evident pleasure rather than apologetic shame, represented a small but significant rebellion. "My grandmother took no sugar at all," Victoria mentions, referring again to Queen Charlotte. "She considered sweetness frivolous, unnecessary, evidence of weak character. She drank her tea black and bitter, and she lived to 74 despite consuming no sugar whatsoever." Dr. Jenner has pointed this out numerous times, as though familial precedent determines biological destiny. I've reminded him that my grandmother also lived in constant fear of going mad like her husband. That terror and restraint consumed her, and that I'd rather die at 60 having enjoyed my tea than survive to 80 having denied myself even small pleasures. You notice that Victoria's sugar cubes come from a locked silver bowl that only she possesses the key for, not because of their monetary value, which is negligible, but because she's tired of servants and physicians monitoring her consumption, counting cubes, making judgments about her choices. The lock is petty, perhaps, childish certainly, but also necessary. It announces that her sweetness belongs to her, that even a queen deserves privacy in her pleasures, that some things remain beyond committees and medical consultations and public scrutiny. The sweetened tea tastes different than the unsweetened version you observed earlier. The sugar doesn't just add sweetness, it modifies everything else. The tea's bitterness becomes less aggressive, the milk's creaminess more apparent, the overall experience rounder, more complete, more satisfying. You understand suddenly why Victoria defends these 2 cubes so fiercely. They're not decorative or optional. They transform the experience from medicinal to pleasurable, from duty to delight, from something endured to something enjoyed. There's a baker in London who's developed sugar-free cakes, Victoria says with evident scepticism. He sent me samples, accompanied by a letter explaining how I could enjoy tea-time treats without the harmful effects of sugar. The cakes tasted like sweetened sawdust, if such a thing can be imagined. I had them returned with a polite note declining further experiments. If I'm going to eat cake, it will contain proper sugar and proper butter and proper flour, and I'll accept whatever consequences follow rather than consuming joyless substitutes that preserve life by making it not worth living. You're watching Victoria wage a quiet war against a medical establishment that views her body as public property, as something requiring management and improvement and constant surveillance. The 2 sugar cubes represent her refusal to be entirely managed, her insistence that pleasure matters even when physicians claim it causes harm. Whether the doctors are right about sugar's effects almost doesn't matter. What matters is Victoria's assertion that she retains authority over her own consumption, her own body, her own small daily pleasures that accumulate into something resembling happiness, or at least its adequate substitute. The tea in her cup grows sweeter as she stirs, and you notice she stirs exactly 15 times, not 14, not 16, but precisely 15 rotations that ensure complete dissolution without creating a vortex that might splash tea onto her dress or the table. Even rebellion follows rules for Victoria. Even defiance proceeds according to protocol. She can resist her physician's advice about sugar, but she'll do so tidily, properly, in ways that don't create mess or disruption beyond the specific point of contention. My children take various amounts of sugar, Victoria continues, and you're receiving a genealogy of sweetness preferences across the royal family. Vicky takes 1 cube like her father did. She's very conscious of maintaining her figure. Bertie takes 4 or 5 when he thinks I'm not watching, which explains his expanding waistline. The younger children vary, though I've noticed that those who experienced more of Albert's influence tend toward less sugar, while those born after his death indulge more freely. Sugar consumption as family trauma mapped onto beverage preferences, Doctor. Jenna would probably write a paper about it if I gave him permission, which I absolutely will not. The 3rd cup of tea, properly sweetened now, provides Victoria with the energy she needs to complete this hour-long ritual. The sugar releases into her bloodstream, providing quick fuel that makes her more alert, more present, more capable of the correspondence and decisions that await her after tea time ends. 32 calories aren't negligible when they're strategic, when they're precisely what your body requires at precisely 4:30 in the afternoon to sustain focus for the evening ahead. Doctor, Jenna sees those calories as problems. Victoria experiences them as solutions. You watch her finish the sweetened cup, and there's satisfaction in her face that wasn't present with the earlier unsweetened portions. This is what she wanted, what she's been working towards through bread and butter and sandwiches and cake, this sweetened conclusion to her daily ritual, this reward for enduring another day of empire and widowhood and public scrutiny. The sugar cubes have dissolved completely, leaving no visible trace, but their effect lingers in the way Victoria's shoulders relax, in the slight smile that touches her lips, in the momentary peace that settles over her like the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. The sugar bowl sits before her, lock secured, contents measured by no one except Victoria herself. It's a small kingdom within the larger kingdom she rules, a tiny territory where she alone determines policy and consumption and consequence. 2 cubes today, 2 cubes tomorrow, 2 cubes for as many tomorrows as she has remaining. This is Victoria's line in the sand, her declaration that some pleasures survive even medical disapproval, that sweetness endures despite doctors claiming it shouldn't, that queens possess the right to consume what they choose, even when wiser voices suggest otherwise. The controversy continues, but the sugar cubes keep dropping into her tea with soft plinking sounds that announce this body belongs to its inhabitant. These choices remain mine. This sweetness survives all attempts to eliminate it. You notice tension suddenly crackling through the room, not dramatic, not explosive, but the subtle friction of competing philosophies about to clash over baked goods. A servant approaches carrying 2 covered dishes, and you sense that what's revealed beneath those silver domes will settle a debate that's been simmering in Windsor Castle's kitchen for longer than you've been alive. Victoria watches the approach with evident amusement, and you realise she's aware of the conflict, perhaps even encouraged it, finding entertainment in the passionate disagreements that passionate cooks wage over seemingly trivial matters. The domes lift simultaneously, and there they are, scones on the left, crumpets on the right, both perfect specimens of their kind, both demanding Victoria's favour like rival suitors in a very British courtship. Mrs. Farley insists scones represent the pinnacle of British baking. Victoria tells you, selecting a scone and examining it critically, her sous chef, a young woman named Mary Hopkins, who trained in Yorkshire, claims that crumpets deserve the honour. They've been arguing about this for 3 years now, ever since Mary joined the household. The debate has become so elaborate that they've enlisted other kitchen staff into opposing factions. Last month, the pastry assistant actually resigned because the atmosphere had grown too contentious over scones and crumpets. Can you imagine? The scone in Victoria's hand looks simple golden brown exterior, presumably soft interior, studded with currants that create dark punctuation marks across its surface. It's been cut horizontally, ready to receive butter or jam or clotted cream, revealing a texture that appears simultaneously crumbly and cohesive, that paradoxical structure that defines well-made scones, Mrs. Farley's scones follow a recipe inherited from her Scottish grandmother, Victoria explains, involving specific ratios of flour to buttermilk that create rise without yeast, tenderness without mushiness, flavour without overwhelming the accompaniments they're designed to carry. The scone faction argues that scones are inherently superior because they're structurally sound, Victoria continues, and you can hear her channeling Mrs. Farley's position. You can transport scones, wrap them, save them for later consumption. They don't require immediate eating like crumpets do. They're civilised, portable, adaptable to various contexts. You could serve scones at a garden party, at a formal tea, at a casual gathering, at a solitary tea time like this one. Versatility suggests superiority, or so Mrs. Farley claims. But then there are the crumpets, sitting on their plate with those distinctive crater-covered surfaces, those honeycomb holes that exist specifically to trap butter and make it pool in delicious little wells. The crumpets arrived hot from the kitchen, having been toasted moments before serving, and you can see steam still rising from their spongy surfaces. They look more alien than scones, more architecturally interesting, more demanding of attention and immediate consumption. Mary Hopkins's crumpets are legendary within palace circles. Victoria admits somehow achieving the perfect balance between sturdy base and absorbent top, between yeasty flavour and neutral carrier for whatever butter or honey or jam you choose to apply. The crumpet faction counters that crumpets represent British ingenuity at its finest, Victoria says, now channeling Mary's arguments. They point out that crumpets require skill. You can't just mix ingredients and hope for success. The batter must ferment precisely. The griddle must maintain exact temperature. The crumpets must cook on one side only, creating those holes through steam release without burning the bottom. Crumpets are edible science, they argue. proof that British baking evolved beyond simple mixing and baking into something approaching engineering. Historians still argue whether the scone versus crumpet debate represents genuine culinary philosophy or simply kitchen boredom manifesting as artificial controversy. What's certain is that Victoria encourages rather than suppresses these disputes, finding them more entertaining than most of what Parliament presents her, more genuine than courtly politeness, more human than diplomatic negotiations. The kitchen hierarchy's passionate disagreements about baked goods remind her that normal people care intensely about seemingly small things, that the world contains passions beyond politics and power. You watch Victoria butter her scone proper butter, generous application, edge-to-edge coverage that Albert taught her years ago. The butter melts slightly on contact with the warm scone, creating that perfect semi-liquid state where it's absorbed into the crumb structure but still visible as golden glossiness. She takes a bite, chewing thoughtfully, and you see her mentally cataloguing textures and flavours and how they interact with the bread and sandwiches and cake she's already consumed. Excellent structure, she pronounces. Mrs. Farley has outdone herself. The buttermilk creates a tanginess that prevents cloying sweetness, and the currants provide textural interest without dominating. A very fine scone indeed. But then she reaches for a crumpet, and the entire dynamic shifts. The crumpet's surface holds butter in those distinctive holes, creating concentrated pockets of richness separated by plainer crumpet material, alternating between intense butteriness and more subtle bread flavour. Victoria has spread the butter thickly, far more butter than the scone received because crumpets demand it, because their entire purpose involves absorbing and displaying butter in ways that other breads cannot. She bites into one of the butter pools, and you see her expression change, see pleasure overtake critical evaluation. The problem, Victoria says after swallowing, is that they're both right. Scones are superior for certain contexts, crumpets for others. Scones travel better, but crumpets taste better when fresh. Scones pair well with jam and cream, but crumpets showcase butter more effectively. Scones feel like afternoon, but crumpets feel like indulgence. How can one possibly choose? She looks genuinely troubled, as though this culinary decision carries weight beyond its actual significance. And perhaps for her it does, perhaps in a life where most choices involve consequences measured in lives and territories and historical legacy. The relative merits of scones versus crumpets offer refreshing stakes. The kitchen factions, you learn, have developed elaborate arguments supporting their positions. Mrs. Farley's scone advocates point to historical precedent scones date back centuries, appearing in Scottish and English cooking long before crumpets achieved their current form. Tradition matters, they argue, and scones possess traditional authority that crumpets lack. Mary's crumpet faction counters that crumpets represent evolution, improvement, the refinement of basic bread concepts into something more interesting and pleasurable. Clinging to tradition for its own sake suggests stagnation rather than wisdom. They claim, "I've suggested they share the honour," Victoria mentions, consuming another bite of crumpet. Both could appear on the middle tier, side by side, demonstrating that royal tea time has room for multiple forms of excellence. Mrs. Farley found this suggestion insulting, apparently compromise, suggest we cannot identify true superiority, which reflects poorly on royal judgment. Mary agreed with Mrs. Farley on this point, which represented their only moment of accord in 3 years. They both want victory, not accommodation. You're watching a miniature version of the conflicts that define Victoria's reign, disputes where both sides possess valid arguments, where choosing one means offending the other, where wisdom might involve recognizing that different contexts require different solutions, but where institutional pressure demands singular answers. Victoria rules an empire full of competing interests and incompatible desires, And she cannot please everyone, cannot craft policies that satisfy both industrialists and workers, cannot govern in ways that make both India and England happy. The scone crumpet debate offers a smaller, safer version of these impossible choices. I've decided to alternate, Victoria announces, as though this decision required deliberation equal to military strategy. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays feature scones, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays feature crumpets. Sundays I take neither, consuming only bread and sandwiches and cake, giving my digestive system respite from the debate. This solution satisfies no one completely, which means it's probably fair. She smiles slightly, and you recognise this as the wisdom of someone who's learned that perfect solutions rarely exist. That governance, whether of empires or tea times, often involves disappointing everyone equally rather than making anyone completely happy. The scones and crumpets sit side by side today because it's a special occasion you're visiting, though Victoria doesn't specify why your presence warrants this culinary summit. Perhaps she enjoys demonstrating the absurdity of palace life, the way trivial matters become consuming controversies, the manner in which intelligent people invest enormous energy into questions that most of the world would dismiss as ridiculous. Or perhaps she's simply lonely, and explaining her kitchen's internal politics provides conversation more interesting than discussing government dispatches or family complaints. You watch her finish the scone and crumpet, and you notice she leaves remnants of both on her plate, not enough to constitute waste, but enough to suggest she hasn't chosen between them, hasn't awarded victory to either faction. The inconclusiveness is deliberate, strategic, designed to keep the debate alive because apparently Victoria finds it entertaining, finds it humanising, finds it preferable to the alternative where everyone agrees and nothing interesting happens in the kitchen except efficient production of predetermined foods. Next week, Victoria says with anticipation, Mrs. Farley plans to introduce her definitive scone. Apparently she's been perfecting the recipe for months, adjusting ratios by infinitesimal amounts, testing different flours and different currants. Mary has countered by announcing her ultimate crumpet, which will supposedly settle the debate forever. I've already arranged to be present for the grand unveiling. The kitchen rivalry has become my favourite entertainment, more engaging than most theatre productions, more genuine than court intrigue where everyone performs their conflicts rather than feeling them authentically. The empty plates sit before you, scattered with crumbs and butter smears, evidence of consumption but not of conclusion. The debate continues, the factions remain divided, and Victoria presides over it all with the amused detachment of someone who recognises that some questions don't require answers, that some conflicts serve purposes beyond resolution, that sometimes the argument matters more than the outcome. Scones versus crumpets, it's ridiculous, it's petty, it's utterly human, and it's exactly the kind of thing that makes Victoria's regimented, grief-shadowed, responsibility-laden life occasionally bearable. You notice Victoria reaching for two small crystal dishes, one containing deep red preserve, the other holding thick cream so pale it's nearly white, and you sense you're about to witness another battlefield where preferences become politics, where personal taste ignites regional pride, where something as simple as condiment selection carries implications that ripple outward from this room into counties and households across England. Victoria hovers between the two dishes, and the servant holding them stands perfectly still, face neutral, but you detect tension in his posture, awareness that his Queen's choice matters to people far beyond this castle's walls. This is the jam and clotted cream debate, and it's been raging longer than Victoria's been alive. "Strawberry preserve!" Victoria announces, selecting the red jar first. From a farm in Kent that's been supplying the royal household since my grandfather's time. The farmer's great-grandson runs it now, and he writes me letters, actual letters to the Queen detailing weather conditions and crop yields and how this year's strawberries compare to historical standards. He's quite passionate about fruit. She spreads the jam across a scone half with careful precision, and you notice the preserve is thick, chunky with fruit pieces rather than smooth jelly, deep red rather than bright pink, suggesting berries picked at peak ripeness and cooked minimally to preserve their essential strawberryness. The strawberry preference itself sparked controversy when Victoria first expressed it publicly. Raspberry had been the royal standard, she explains, positioning clotted cream on top of the jam, and you notice this order specifically. Jam first, then cream, which you're learning carries its own significance. My uncles preferred raspberry, my grandfather ate raspberry, and apparently raspberry represented continuity, tradition, proper British taste. When I requested strawberry instead, several courtiers suggested I was being difficult, choosing novelty over wisdom. I informed them that I'd been eating strawberry jam since childhood and saw no reason to alter my preference simply because raspberries had historical precedent. Albert supported me naturally. He usually did in matters of food and taste. The strawberry preserve comes from a specific variety of berry. You're learning that nothing in Victoria's tea time happens accidentally or generically. The farmer grows Royal Sovereign strawberries. A cultivar developed in 1892. No. Wait. That's impossible. It's only 1870. You've confused your dates. The farmer grows a predecessor variety. Something local to Kent. Something that produces small, intensely flavoured berries rather than the larger, milder commercial varieties that are beginning to dominate markets. These strawberries taste like concentrated summer, like sunshine converted into red fruit, like childhood memories of garden picking and jam making with her governess Letson, who Victoria rarely mentions but occasionally remembers through food associations. The raspberry faction still exists, Victoria continues, and you're amazed that produce preference generates factions, that fruit selection becomes identity politics. They're centred in Scotland primarily, where raspberry cultivation has longer tradition and where my preference for English strawberries is interpreted as southern bias. They're not entirely wrong. I do favour English suppliers when possible, partly from genuine preference and partly because supporting English agriculture seems appropriate for England's Queen. Though I suppose that's nationalistic of me. Albert would have encouraged more continental suppliers, but Albert isn't here to advocate for German jam. Historians still argue whether Victoria's strawberry preference represented genuine taste or strategic positioning during a period when English national identity was being actively constructed and promoted. By choosing English strawberries over Scottish raspberries, by favouring Kent farmers over continental suppliers. Victoria participated in defining Britishness through consumption choices that her subjects noticed and occasionally emulated. Every jar of strawberry preserve that left Windsor Castle carried implicit messages about what England valued, what tastes defined proper British character, what regions deserved royal favour and the economic benefits that followed. The clotted cream sits atop the jam now, thick and luxurious, creating a construction that seems architecturally unsound. Surely it will collapse. Surely this tower of scone and jam and cream cannot survive the journey from plate to mouth. But Victoria lifts it confidently, and somehow it holds together. And you realise this too requires technique, requires understanding structural engineering applied to dairy and baked goods. The cream itself comes from Devon, from a dairy that specialises in this peculiarly British product that foreigners find baffling and slightly disgusting cream. so thick you can stand a spoon in it. Cream that's more solid than liquid. Cream that suggests butter but maintains cream's essential identity. The cream order sparked its own controversy, Victoria mentions before taking a bite. Cornwall insists cream should go on first, then jam on top. Devon does jam first, then cream, which is how I prefer it. The two counties have been arguing about this for generations, and my choice for Devon's method essentially awarded that county victory in a dispute that probably predates my birth. Cornwall's tourism board wrote me a formal letter of complaint, a tourism board, about cream placement. I didn't respond, which I suppose constituted its own statement. You watch her bite into the constructed scone, and cream and jam blend with buttery scone, and something close to bliss crosses her face. This combination strawberry's bright acidity cutting through clotted cream's rich fattiness, both softening the scone's crumbly texture. All three elements creating something superior to any component alone represents British tea time at its most successful. It's excessive, probably unhealthy, definitely unnecessary from a nutritional standpoint, yet somehow essential, somehow exactly right for this moment and this woman and this ritual that sustained her through years that might have broken someone less committed to small daily pleasures. Clotted cream contains approximately 60% fat, Victoria says matter-of-factly. Doctor. Jenna has calculated that I consume approximately 100 grams during each tea time when scones are present, which translates to, I don't recall the exact number, but it was large and said in that tone physicians use when they want you to feel guilty about enjoying yourself. I informed him that I'm 51 years old. I've birthed 9 children. I've ruled an empire for 33 years, and I've buried the only man I ever loved. If clotted cream brings me momentary happiness, I'll consume it despite his arithmetic. The strawberry preserve glistens in the afternoon light, and you notice that Victoria uses approximately twice as much jam as cream, not because of health considerations, but because she genuinely prefers the fruit-forward profile this ratio creates. Some people use scones as butter and cream delivery vehicles. Overwhelming the fruit component, Victoria treats the scone as a platform for showcasing strawberries, with cream providing richness without dominating. The distinction matters to her, this balance between elements, this refusal to let any single component tyrannize the others. I've tried other preserves, Victoria admits, constructing a second scone jam cream tower. Blackberry, apricot, plum, even gooseberry, though that was dreadful, far too tart even with generous cream. None satisfied like strawberry does. Perhaps it's merely familiarity, neural pathways established in childhood that crave repetition. Or perhaps strawberries genuinely pair best with cream and scone among available British fruits. I've stopped analysing it. Some preferences resist rational explanation, and trying to understand them only diminishes the pleasure they provide. You notice the strawberry farmer's jar has a handwritten label not printed, not professionally designed, just neat handwriting recording the date of production and the farmer's initials. This personal touch pleases Victoria more than elaborate packaging would. She likes knowing that someone picked these berries, cooked them with sugar in copper pots, jarred them while still hot, labelled them by hand, and sent them to Windsor thinking about how the Queen would receive them. The connection between producer and consumer, usually invisible in palace life where everything arrives through intermediaries and servants, becomes briefly tangible through this handwritten label. The economic impact of my strawberry preference is apparently significant, Victoria mentions, and there's slight discomfort in her voice now. The Kent farmer expanded his operation, hired additional workers, acquired more land, all because I favour his product. Other strawberry farmers have attempted to win royal contracts, creating competition that drives quality up and prices down. My personal preference has shaped an entire regional agricultural sector, which seems absurd but is apparently true. One woman's jam choice becomes economic policy through the mechanisms of royal influence and consumer emulation. The cream and jam continue their peaceful coexistence on Victoria's scone, neither overwhelming the other, both contributing to an experience that transcends individual components. You're learning that Victoria thinks about food philosophically, sees in these simple combinations larger truths about balance, proportion, the dangers of excess, the importance of letting each element express its essential nature while contributing to collective harmony. She's probably reading too much into scones and condiments, probably projecting emotional needs onto dairy products and fruit preserves. But perhaps that's what people do when grief has made direct emotional expression too painful. They channel feelings into safer subjects like jam preferences and cream debates. When I die, Victoria says, finishing her second scone, someone will probably write that I preferred strawberry jam and Devon cream on my scones, and that fact will be preserved for historians, while more important aspects of my reign fade into footnotes. Future students will memorize my condiment preferences while forgetting my actual policies. There's something both humiliating and comforting about that being remembered for small personal details rather than grand historical actions. At least the strawberry preference is genuinely mine, genuinely true, rather than some sanitized official version that removes everything human and interesting. The empty scone plate sits before her, bearing traces of red jam and white cream, evidence of consumption and preference and the minor rebellions that Victoria stages daily against doctors and tradition, and anyone who thinks they know better than she does about what brings her comfort. The strawberry preserve has been championed. The Devon cream has won its eternal victory over Cornish methodology. And somewhere in Kent a farmer tends his berries, knowing that England's queen awaits his harvest with anticipation that transcends mere appetite, that touches something deeper about memory and loss, and the small things that make continued living bearable, even when the person you most wanted to share them with is 9 years dead. You notice Victoria glancing toward a small ornate tin sitting on the side table, and something in her expression changes, becomes almost conspiratorial, as though she's about to share a secret that matters more than all the formal foods you've witnessed so far. The tin itself looks unpretentious compared to the silver and crystal surrounding it, decorated with a faded tartan pattern that speaks of Scotland again. Always Scotland. That place that holds Victoria's heart more securely than England ever could. She reaches for it with the casual familiarity of long habit, and you understand immediately that this tin and its contents represent something different from the structured protocol of the three-tiered stand. This is personal territory, unregulated by kitchen staff or medical advisors, governed entirely by Victoria's fluctuating moods and private cravings. "My biscuit tin," Victoria announces, lifting the lid to reveal an assortment of cookies that look homely compared to the elaborate presentations you've seen earlier. "This is where protocol ends and preference begins. Mrs. Farley has no authority here. Doctor, Jenna doesn't know this tin exists, or rather, he knows but has wisely chosen not to comment. What goes in this tin when I consume it? How much I eat, these decisions belong exclusively to me." She selects a piece of shortbread, pale golden and crumbly, and you see something like defiance in the gesture, assertion of autonomy in a life where almost everything else is managed by others. The shortbread dominates the tin's real estate, and you learn this is deliberate, strategic, reflecting Victoria's clear hierarchy of biscuit preferences. Scottish shortbread, She explains unnecessarily. The buttery aroma and distinctive texture make its identity obvious. From a bakery in Edinburgh that's been producing it since before I was born. The recipe supposedly dates to the 16th century, which makes it older than my entire dynasty. That appeals to me somehow, eating something that predates Hanoverian rule. That connected to medieval Scotland when life was simpler and queens were mythological rather than actual. She takes a bite. And butter and sugar and flour combine into that distinctive shortbread experience that's simultaneously rich and subtle, indulgent and restrained. The tin itself holds approximately 15 to 20 biscuits at full capacity. Though you notice it's currently half empty, Victoria's been consuming from it for several days, rationing the contents according to patterns only she understands. The shortbread pieces are thick cut, substantial rather than delicate, designed for people who appreciate heft and texture rather than elaborate decoration. No icing adorns them, no chocolate coating, no artistic flourishes, just pure butter and flour expression that Victoria clearly prefers to more complicated confections. Shortbread is Scottish honesty in edible form, Victoria muses, examining the piece in her hand. What you see is what you receive: butter, sugar, flour, nothing hidden, nothing pretending to be more than it is. The English would have added preserves or cream or elaborate decoration, turning simple excellence into complicated adequacy. The Scots understand that some things achieve perfection through restraint rather than elaboration. There's affection in her voice, that particular warmth she reserves for anything Scottish. Anything connected to Balmoral and Highlands and the landscape where she feels most herself. But the tin contains other varieties too. Arranged according to hierarchy you're beginning to decipher. Ginger snaps occupy one corner darker, spicier, more aggressive than the mellow shortbread. Victoria explains that she reaches for these when she's irritable, when cabinet meetings have frustrated her, when family letters arrive carrying news of romantic disappointments or financial extravagances that require her attention. Ginger matches certain moods, she says simply. Days when I want my food to bite back, to possess character that doesn't apologise for being sharp. Albert never liked ginger biscuits, too assertive for his taste, so I rarely ate them during our marriage. After he died, I discovered I enjoyed them more than I'd realised, though whether that's genuine preference or grief expressing itself through spice, I cannot say. Historians still argue whether Victoria's food choices after Albert's death represented authentic preference emergence, or whether widowhood simply removed the gentle pressure to conform to Albert's taste that had shaped her consumption for 2 decades. What's certain is that several items appeared in her diet post-1861 that were absent or rare, beforehand the ginger snaps, certain strong cheeses, occasionally wine at luncheon when previously she'd abstained. Whether these represented Victoria discovering herself or Victoria changing in response to loss remains disputed, probably forever. Digestive biscuits occupy another section of the tin plainer than shortbread, less exciting than ginger snaps, but somehow essential in ways that transcend flavour. For digestion, obviously, Victoria says, though there's scepticism in her tone. Doctor, Jenna prescribed these years ago, claiming they aid intestinal function through wheat fibre or some such medical reasoning. I've detected no digestive improvements, but I've developed affection for their wheaty plainness, their absolute lack of pretension. You cannot be disappointed by a digestive biscuit because it promises nothing except utility and delivers exactly that. The biscuit selection varies weekly. You learn, based on Victoria's requests transmitted through her personal maid to Mrs. Farley's kitchen staff. Some weeks the tin contains only shortbread because Victoria craves consistency, needs the comfort of predictable butter and flour. Other weeks she requests variety shortbread plus ginger snaps plus digestives, plus perhaps lemon wafers or almond cookies or Occasionally the chocolate-covered biscuits she pretends not to love but actually adores. The tin's contents become a mood diary, edible documentation of Victoria's emotional weather across weeks and months. I tried keeping exotic biscuits in here briefly, Victoria admits, selecting a ginger snap now, apparently having shifted moods mid-tea time. French macarons, Italian amaretti, German Lebkuchen that reminded me painfully of Albert. They felt wrong somehow, felt like affectation, like I was trying to be cosmopolitan rather than simply being myself. I returned to British biscuits exclusively shortbread, ginger snaps, digestives, and occasionally Bath Oliver crackers, though those aren't technically biscuits. My empire spans the globe, but my biscuit tin remains stubbornly insular, unapologetically British, defiantly simple. You watch her consume the ginger snap with evident satisfaction, and you notice that biscuits receive different eating treatment than formal tea items. The scones were eaten decorously, the sandwiches with careful technique, the cake with reverence bordering on ceremony. But biscuits are consumed casually, sometimes dunked briefly in tea despite etiquette declaring this vulgar, sometimes eaten in 2 large bites rather than small nibbles. Sometimes you see this now eaten while reading dispatches or signing documents, performing the forbidden act of eating while working that Victoria officially condemns, but privately practices when she thinks no one's watching. The tin goes with me everywhere, Victoria mentions, and you understand suddenly that this object travels to Balmoral, to Osborne, occasionally to Buckingham Palace, though she hates staying there. It's become my security object, rather like a child's favourite blanket. Embarrassing to admit, but true. I've had moments of genuine anxiety when I thought I'd left it behind, when I reached for it and found it missing. My household has learned to pack it carefully, ensure it arrives with me wherever I go, keep it filled according to my preferences without requiring me to issue explicit orders. Good servants anticipate needs before they are articulated, and my household staff has become excellent at reading my biscuit requirements. The hierarchy within the tin reflects Victoria's character more accurately than any official portrait. You're realising shortbread dominance speaks to her conservative core, her preference for tradition and proven quality. Ginger snaps acknowledge her capacity for sharpness, for moments when gentleness gives way to assertion. Digestives represent her practical side, her willingness to consume utilitarian foods despite their lack of glamour. The occasional exotic additions that appear and disappear suggest experimental impulses she possesses but rarely indulges. Curiosity that gets briefly satisfied before returning to familiar favourites. My children steal from this tin when they visit, Victoria says with mock severity. They're adults now, most of them, with their own households and their own biscuit supplies, yet they cannot resist pilfering from mine. Vicky takes shortbread. Naturally, she's become quite German in her tastes, but retains affection for Scottish butter biscuits. Bertie takes everything indiscriminately, showing the lack of discrimination that characterises his approach to most pleasures. The younger children request permission before taking, which I appreciate, though I always grant it. The tin's contents are meant for sharing, even though I pretend otherwise. You notice Victoria has consumed 3 biscuits now, 1 shortbread, 1 ginger snap, 1 digestive, completing a trinity that apparently satisfies whatever craving prompted her to open the tin. She closes it carefully, returning it to its place on the side table where it will wait for tomorrow's tea time, or perhaps tonight's late evening when she cannot sleep and needs something familiar to comfort her through dark hours when grief feels freshest. The tin's exterior shows wear, the tartan pattern has faded. One corner is slightly dented. The lid doesn't fit quite as snugly as it once did, but Victoria clearly values it precisely because it's worn. because it carries history, because it's accompanied her through years that have transformed her from young widow into aging empress. "When I die," Victoria says, returning to that morbid refrain that punctuates her tea-time observations. "I've instructed that this tin be buried with me. Not the biscuits inside, those would be wasteful, but the tin itself. It's probably the most personally mine object I possess. Everything else has been given to me or purchased by servants or represents official royal property that will transfer to Bertie. But this tin, I chose it myself during our first visit to Scotland, filled it myself with shortbread from a village bakery, carried it back to Windsor myself without servants handling it. It's mine in ways that crowns and palaces can never be, and I want it with me wherever I end up. Melodramatic, perhaps, but grief has made me melodramatic, and I'm too old to apologise for it." The tin sits quietly on the side table, modest and unpretentious and infinitely more revealing than anything displayed on silver stands or crystal dishes. Inside, biscuits weight some butter rich and Scottish, some ginger sharp and challenging, some plain and utilitarian and somehow perfect in their refusal to be more than they are. Victoria's biscuit tin hierarchy mirrors her internal landscape more accurately than any official document, captures her character more truthfully than formal portraiture, and proves that sometimes the most important things aren't the grandest but the most faithful. The objects that survive transitions and losses and all the weight that accumulates during 33 years of ruling an empire while missing a man who's been dead for 9. You watch Victoria's hand hover again, not over food this time, but between two small vessels that somehow carry weight beyond their size. A delicate china pitcher holds milk, cream pale and slightly warm from its careful preparation. Beside it sits a crystal dish containing lemon slices, translucent yellow rounds floating in their own juice like captured sunshine. This choice, your learning, represents more than flavour preference. It's mood indicator, emotional barometer, secret signal that Victoria's observant servants have learned to read with accuracy that borders on supernatural. She reaches for the milk today, and somewhere behind you a footman relaxes imperceptibly, having correctly predicted her selection and prepared accordingly. This is the milk or lemon ritual, and it reveals Victoria more nakedly than she probably intends. "Albert always took lemon," Victoria says quietly, pouring milk into her 4th cup of tea. "Yes." You've lost count, but apparently the 3-cup rule has exceptions, has flexibility when tea time stretches longer than usual, or when conversation proves engaging enough to justify additional brewing. He claimed milk dulled tea's essential character, obscured the subtle notes that Chinese Assam leaves contributed. He'd squeeze exactly half a lemon slice into his cup. Never a full slice, always half, precise even in citrus application. There's that familiar sadness in her voice, that quality of someone who remembers loved habits with painful clarity, who can still see Albert's hands performing this exact motion though those hands have been motionless in a tomb for 9 years. The milk versus lemon debate divides Britain along lines that are simultaneously arbitrary and deeply meaningful. You're discovering milk drinkers tend toward comfort, tradition, softness. They prefer tea that's rounded, mellowed, made gentle by dairy's fatty richness. Lemon drinkers embrace clarity, brightness, a certain intellectual austerity that values purity over comfort. Victoria shifts between camps depending on factors she's only beginning to articulate, choosing milk on soft days when she needs comfort, lemon on sharp days when clarity feels more necessary than consolation. "My servants have learned to predict my choice," Victoria continues, and there's wonder mixed with slight discomfort in her admission. "They watch my face, apparently, read micro-expressions I'm not aware of making, detect mood shifts before I've consciously registered them. On days when I choose milk, they've already warmed it slightly, not hot, just room temperature rather than cold, because cold milk shocks hot tea and creates unpleasant temperature discord. On lemon days, they've prepared thin slices with seeds removed, ensuring I won't encounter bitter pips or structural inconvenience. It's uncanny how accurately they anticipate me. Sometimes I want to choose the opposite option simply to prove them fallible, but that seems petty. Historians still argue whether Victorian servant classes developed heightened observational skills out of necessity, their employment depending on satisfying employers before requests were articulated, or whether they possessed naturally intuitive temperaments that made them suitable for service work in the first place. What's certain is that Windsor Castle's staff has elevated anticipation to art form, reading Victoria's needs through posture and expression and the 1,000 tiny signals that bodies emit when consciousness isn't guarding them. The milk or lemon choice has become their daily examination, proof of competence measured in dairy accuracy. You watch the milk swirl into Victoria's tea, creating those beautiful spiral patterns as different densities interact, warmer liquid rising through cooler, eventually homogenizing into consistent pale caramel. Victoria's preference for milk today suggests certain things about her emotional state. She's feeling soft rather than sharp, reflective rather than analytical, inclined toward comfort over challenge. The servants have read her correctly, have prepared the milk at optimal temperature, have placed it within easy reach without making the lemon seem rejected or secondary. Everything choreographed to ease Victoria's path through this daily ritual without calling attention to the mechanism supporting it. Lemon days are difficult days, Victoria admits, staring into her milky tea. Days when I'm angry with Albert for dying, angry with myself for surviving, angry with the world for continuing without him. On those days I want tea that bites back, that's astringent and challenging, that doesn't offer comfort I don't deserve. Lemon provides that its acidity transforms tea into something almost medicinal, something you endure rather than enjoy. I choose lemon approximately twice weekly, perhaps 3 times if the week has been particularly trying. The lemon slices sit in their crystal dish, unused today but prepared nonetheless, representing possibility rather than actuality. They're cut precisely 1/8 inch thick enough to release juice when squeezed, but thin enough to fit comfortably in a teacup without requiring removal mid-drinking. The seeds have been meticulously extracted using silver tweezers designed specifically for this purpose, eliminating any chance of bitter seed flavour contaminating the citrus brightness. Someone in the kitchen spent time on these lemon slices that won't be used today, and they'll perform this same service tomorrow and every day afterward, maintaining readiness for Victoria's unpredictable oscillations between milk and lemon moods. The temperature of my tea changes depending on whether I choose milk or lemon, Victoria explains. And you're receiving a physics lesson disguised as tea time conversation. Milk cools tea by approximately 15 degrees, which means the kitchen must brew it slightly hotter if they've predicted a milk day. Lemon doesn't significantly alter temperature but changes how heat is perceived. Acidity creates a sensation of coolness even when temperature remains constant. Misses. Farley has charts documenting all this. Actual scientific charts with temperature curves and cooling rates. She takes tea service more seriously than most ministers take governance. You notice that Victoria's milk selection has created a cascade of servant adjustments you're only now detecting. The sugar bowl has been positioned slightly closer. Milk tea accepts sugar more readily than lemon tea does. And servants anticipate she might want additional sweetness. The remaining scone has been subtly warmed milk tea pairs better, with warm baked goods while lemon tea suits cooler items. Even the lighting has been minutely adjusted, curtains drawn slightly wider to admit more afternoon sun that complements milk tea's golden softness, whereas lemon days apparently warrant slightly dimmer ambience that suits tea's sharper character. The entire room has been modulated to match her beverage choice, and she's barely noticed. "I tried taking both once," Victoria mentions with a slight smile. Milk in one cup, lemon in another, alternating between them to satisfy both moods simultaneously. It was dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. The flavour profiles clashed in my mouth, created confusion on my palate, left me feeling worse than if I'd chosen neither. Some decisions cannot be split or compromised. They demand commitment, require accepting one path and relinquishing the other. Rather like most important life choices, actually, you cannot be both widowed and married, both grieving and healed, both attached and free. You choose your path and accept its implications. The milk pitcher empties as Victoria pours herself what you suspect will be her final cup of this extended tea time. The lemon slices remain pristine, untouched, awaiting tomorrow or the day after when Victoria wakes feeling sharp rather than soft, when she needs brightness rather than comfort, when she wants tea that challenges rather than consoles. The servants will prepare both options tomorrow as they did today, maintaining perfect readiness for either choice, demonstrating the flexibility that service requires, being prepared for multiple possibilities while appearing utterly unsurprised by whichever materializes. My children have inherited my oscillation between milk and lemon, Victoria observes, sipping her newly milky tea with evident satisfaction. Vicky takes milk consistently. She's seeking comfort constantly. Poor thing, trapped in that German court with her difficult husband. Bertie takes lemon when he's trying to appear sophisticated, milk when he's being himself, which tells you something about his authenticity issues. The younger children haven't yet established firm preferences, still experimenting, still discovering which version of themselves they'll become. I envy them that uncertainty sometimes. That openness to possibility before life forces you into patterns that become increasingly difficult to alter. You watch the afternoon light shift slightly, lengthening shadows that indicate this tea time is approaching its conclusion, that Victoria will soon dismiss her servants and sit alone with her thoughts and her cooling tea. But right now, in this moment, she's content with her milk choice, satisfied that she read her own mood correctly, pleased that her servants anticipated her correctly, comfortable in the predictable rhythms of ritual that have sustained her through years that would have destroyed someone less committed, to small, daily structures that provide meaning when larger meanings have collapsed. The milk pitcher and lemon dish will both be cleared soon. Return to the kitchen where tomorrow's versions will be prepared with identical care and precision. Mrs. Farley will note in her log that today was a milk day, adding this data point to years of accumulated information that charts Victoria's emotional weather through beverage choices. The servants who predicted correctly will feel quiet satisfaction at their accuracy, while those who guessed wrong will recalibrate their observation skills, paying closer attention to the subtle signals they missed this time. And Victoria will continue oscillating between milk and lemon, between softness and sharpness, between comfort and challenge, using tea as emotional expression when words feel inadequate or too revealing, when controlling beverage selection provides the illusion of controlling everything else that feels perpetually beyond her grasp. The tea steams gently, milk softened and perfect for this particular afternoon. Exactly what Victoria needed even before she knew she needed it. You notice Victoria's gaze drifting toward a cabinet you hadn't previously observed. tucked discreetly against the far wall where afternoon light doesn't quite reach. The cabinet itself looks unremarkable dark wood. Simple brass handles, about 4 feet tall, but something in Victoria's expression suggests it contains significance beyond its modest exterior. She rises from her chair with the slight effort that accompanies 51 years and increasing weight, crosses the room with purpose, and opens the cabinet doors to reveal shelves holding what appears to be an entire museum of porcelain. Teapots, cups, saucers, serving dishes all arranged with archival precision, each piece representing a memory, a relationship, a moment frozen in ceramic form. "My tea services," Victoria announces, and you hear possessiveness in those words, ownership that transcends legal property into emotional territory. 47 complete services, she continues, running her fingers along a particularly ornate Chinese porcelain set, decorated with dragons and peonies in cobalt blue and copper red. Each one a gift, a commemoration, a diplomatic gesture that became personal possession. This one arrived from the Chinese emperor in 1842 when I was still young and Britain was forcing opium on his people while pretending superiority. The irony wasn't lost on me, receiving exquisite tea service from a nation we were systematically destroying. I use it anyway. Though, beauty doesn't bear responsibility for the circumstances of its creation. Oh. She lifts a cup, examining it in the fading light, and you see how the glaze catches illumination, transforming it into something almost luminous. The cabinet contains geography lessons disguised as dinnerware. You're realizing French Sèvres porcelain sits beside Japanese emari ware, which neighbours German Meissen alongside English Wedgwood. Each service represents a nation, an alliance, a diplomatic relationship formalised through the strangely intimate gesture of providing vessels from which Victoria will consume her daily tea. The collection spans her entire reign. The oldest pieces date from her coronation year, when foreign powers rushed to present gifts to the young queen who'd unexpectedly inherited Britain's throne. The newest editions arrived recently, still gleaming with the perfection of unused objects waiting to enter rotation. I rotate through them systematically, Victoria explains. Selecting a different service, this one appears to be Meissen. White porcelain with delicate gold trim and scattered flowers that might be forget-me-nots. Each service receives use approximately once every 6 weeks, ensuring none languishes neglected while maintaining sufficient variety to prevent boredom. Mrs. Farley tracks the rotation in her log, noting which service was used on which date, flagging any that show wear requiring repair. 3 services are currently with a porcelain restorer in London, a chip here, a crack there. Nothing catastrophic, but requiring attention before damage becomes irreparable. I'm quite precious about maintenance. These objects will outlive me if properly cared for, will serve Bertie and his children and perhaps their children. Physical continuity across generations that bodies cannot provide. Historians still argue whether Victoria's obsessive collection and rotation of tea services represented genuine appreciation for decorative arts, or whether she used objects as emotional surrogates, investing in animate porcelain with significance that helped her navigate relationships with the living people who'd gifted them. What's certain is that she remembered the provenance of every piece, could identify which service came from which donor without consulting records, attach stories to patterns and glazes that transformed commercial products into narrative vessels containing more than just tea. You watch her select today's service, you're only now understanding that what you've been observing throughout tea time represents conscious choice from among 47 possibilities. She's chosen a relatively simple English service today, cream-coloured with a thin gold band and her monogram discreetly placed on each piece. My personal service, she explains. Not gifted by anyone, not diplomatically significant, just purchased for my own use shortly after Albert died. I commissioned it specifically the cream colour because black mourning extended to dinnerware felt excessive, the gold band because complete austerity seemed unnecessarily punishing, the monogram because I wanted something that belonged unambiguously to me rather than to my position. I use this service on private days, when I'm taking tea alone or only with family, when I don't need to honour diplomatic relationships or signal political alignments through porcelain selection. The simple service sitting before you suddenly carries new meaning. You've been witnessing Victoria's most personal choice, the one that represents her rather than her obligations. She could have selected the magnificent Russian service with its malachite green borders and gold imperial eagles. She could have chosen the Indian set decorated with miniature paintings of the Taj Mahal and Kashmir landscapes. Instead, she selected this modest English service that announces only her name and preferences, that makes no statements except existence, that comforts through simplicity rather than impressing through elaboration. The Russian service terrifies me slightly, Victoria admits, gesturing toward an elaborate set whose every surface appears covered in decoration gilt edges, painted scenes, jewel-like details that transform functional objects into art pieces you'd hesitate to actually use. It arrived after the Crimean War ended, which seemed either generous or deliberately ironic given that we'd just spent years killing each other's soldiers. The Tsar's note suggested it represented hopes for renewed friendship, but I detected reproach in the extravagance, as though he was reminding me that Russia possessed artistic sophistication that Britain couldn't match. I use it when Russian diplomats visit, performing the theatre of appreciation while privately finding it overwhelming. Too much decoration becomes its own form of aggression. Doesn't it beauty wielded as weapon rather than gift? You notice that each service occupies its designated space within the cabinet, arranged not alphabetically or chronologically, but according to some organisational system that makes sense only to Victoria. She's grouped them by emotional association perhaps, or frequency of use, or how they make her feel when she looks at them. The Chinese service sits near the Russian one, both representing complex relationships with empires that Britain simultaneously trades with and opposes. The German services cluster together several of them, gifts from Albert's relatives before and after his death, porcelain connections to the man she loved and the homeland he carried within him until typhoid ended everything. Albert's favourite service, Victoria says softly, touching a set decorated with dark blue borders and gold medallions, unmistakably Germanic in its precise decoration and sturdy construction. Gift from his brother Ernst, presented on our 10th wedding anniversary. We used it constantly those final years. Albert liked its lack of pretension, its combination of quality and restraint. After he died, I couldn't bear using it. Couldn't bear seeing these cups and saucers we'd shared, drinking from vessels that had touched his lips, being reminded with every sip that he wasn't there to share the ritual. I locked it away for 5 years. Only recently have I begun using it again, and only on dates that matter: his birthday, our anniversary, Christmas. Grief attachment transferred to porcelain, which probably sounds insane. But there it is. The cabinet contains more than dinnerware. You're understanding it's Victoria's external memory, physical manifestation of relationships and losses in the diplomatic dance she's performed for 3 decades. Each service represents a person who thought about her preferences, who commissioned or selected something intended specifically for her use, who tried to please or impress or honour her through ceramic offerings. Some donors are dead now, Albert obviously, but also other monarchs, diplomats, family members who gifted services and then departed, leaving only their porcelain choices behind as evidence they'd existed and thought about Victoria's tea-time happiness. The Japanese service confuses me, Victoria mentions, indicating a set with asymmetric decoration and deliberate irregularities that violate European aesthetic principles. It arrived when Japan was just opening to Western trade, early in that relationship before we understood each other's aesthetic languages. The cups have no handles, you're meant to hold them directly, tolerating the heat or waiting for cooling. The teapot pours awkwardly by British standards, its spout positioned in ways that seem almost perverse. Yet there's something compelling about its strangeness, something that makes me reach for it when I'm feeling adventurous or when European precision feels suffocating. I use it rarely, but meaningfully, when I need reminding that other cultures have solved the tea-drinking challenge differently and perhaps equally well. You watch Victoria close the cabinet doors, returning the 46 unused services to their darkness, leaving only her personal cream and gold set on the table, where it served this entire extended tea time. The choice feels significant amid all available options, amid diplomatic pressures and aesthetic possibilities and the temptation to showcase wealth through elaborate porcelain displays. She selected the simplest option, the one that speaks only of herself rather than relationships or obligations, or the complex political machinery that governs her public life. "When I die," Victoria says, and you're growing accustomed to this refrain. There's need to plan her death's details as though controlling those future arrangements provides comfort in present uncertainty. "I've instructed that specific services be distributed to specific people. Vicky receives the German services. Naturally, she's German now, trapped in that identity regardless of her British birth. Bertie receives the French services because he adores Paris and French culture, despite his position requiring he pretend otherwise. The Russian services will be sold, no point pretending warm relationships exist where they don't. The Chinese services go to museums, where they can be appreciated for artistic merit without the complications of ongoing colonial exploitation. And my personal service." She pauses, touching the cream-coloured cup before her. "My personal service gets buried with me, along with my biscuit tin and Albert's dressing gown and the other objects that matter more than crowns or jewels or anything historians will consider significant." The cabinet stands closed now, protecting its contents from dust and damage and the afternoon light that might fade their colours across decades of exposure. Inside, 46 tea services wait their turns, maintaining readiness for the rotation that will bring them briefly into use before returning them to storage. Each one represents possibility, diplomatic necessity, aesthetic pleasure, emotional connection, or simple variety that prevents monotony across years of daily tea-time ritual. Victoria has created a system where porcelain choice becomes meaningful, where selecting which service to use carries weight beyond practical consideration, where even functional decisions about what cup to drink from become opportunities for memory and relationship, and the complex emotional work that transforms mere consumption into something approaching communion with absent people and distant places. The cream and gold service sits before you, simple and elegant and somehow perfect, exactly right for this afternoon and this woman and this particular moment in a reign that will span decades, but whose most authentic hours happen here, in this private room, with tea steaming from porcelain chosen not for diplomatic purposes, but for personal comfort, for the rare luxury of pleasing only herself. You've been so focused on Victoria and her consumption that you've barely noticed the invisible choreography happening around you. The human machinery that makes this tea time appear effortless when it actually requires precision that would exhaust most people just watching it unfold. But now, Victoria gestures subtly, and suddenly you're seeing what's been invisible. 8 servants positioned throughout the room and corridor beyond, each one assigned specific responsibilities in a 23-minute ballet that begins before Victoria enters and continues until she dismisses them with a gesture so slight You'd miss it if you weren't watching carefully. This is the servant choreography behind the scenes, and it's more elaborate than most theatrical productions, more precisely timed than military operations, more essential to Victoria's tea time than the actual food and drink it delivers. They begin preparing at 3:30, Victoria explains. Though she's never witnessed this preparation herself, queens don't observe backstage mechanics, don't visit kitchens or watch servants arrange rooms. Her knowledge comes from reports, from occasional questions, from the general awareness that her comfort requires labour she'll never fully witness. The room must be warmed to precisely 68 degrees Fahrenheit, not 67, not 69, but 68. Misses. Farley has a thermometer she consults obsessively, adjusting the fire or opening windows by inches until the temperature stabilizes. Then the furniture must be positioned my chair at specific distance from the fire, the tea table at specific height relative to my seated position, the side tables within arm's reach but not so close they create crowding, every element calibrated to permit maximum comfort with minimum conscious awareness of arrangement. You watch a footman you hadn't previously noticed standing absolutely motionless near the door, and you realise he's been there the entire time, stationary as furniture, so still that your eye simply passed over him without registering human presence. His job, Victoria explains, is monitoring the corridor, ensuring no one disturbs tea time, intercepting servants arriving with dishes and coordinating their entries so Victoria never sees two servants simultaneously. That would suggest chaos, would imply her household lacks sufficient staff to provide seamless service, would force her to acknowledge the machinery rather than simply experiencing its results. He's been standing there for over an hour, moving only his eyes, probably needing to urinate by now, but trained to suppress biological needs until dismissed. The tea itself requires the most complex coordination, Victoria continues, and you're getting an education in thermodynamics and timing that most chemistry students never receive. Water must reach exactly 212 degrees Fahrenheit full boiling point at sea level. The teapot must be pre-warmed by filling it with hot water, letting it sit exactly 90 seconds, then emptying it immediately before adding tea leaves. The leaves themselves, Victoria's specific blend, must be measured precisely. Too few and the tea tastes weak, suggesting poverty or carelessness. Too many and it becomes bitter, suggesting ignorance about proper proportions. Misses. Farley uses a scale, actually weighs the tea leaves to ensure consistency across days and years. The timing becomes even more intricate when you understand that servants must predict exactly when Victoria will finish her current cup and require a fresh pot. They cannot ask that would interrupt her thoughts or conversations, would acknowledge their presence in ways that violate service protocol. Instead, they observe. One servant's entire responsibility involves watching Victoria's tea consumption, noting when she drains her cup, calculating how many minutes until she'll want more, signalling to the kitchen that a fresh pot should begin brewing so it arrives precisely when needed. This servant has developed expertise in reading Victoria's drinking pace, understanding that some days she sips slowly while other days she drinks faster, adjusting predictions based on factors that include weather, mood, and what food she's consuming alongside the tea. The temperature precision extends to everything, Victoria says, seemingly reading your growing amazement at the complexity you've been unconsciously benefiting from. Milk arrives at room temperature 70 degrees exactly. Butter for bread must be soft enough to spread without tearing, but not so warm it appears melted. The scones arrive precisely 3 minutes after leaving the oven. That narrow window when they're cool enough to touch but still retain interior warmth. Cucumber sandwiches must be made no more than 20 minutes before serving or moisture degrades the bread. Every element timed like synchronized clockwork, like celestial mechanics applied to food service. Historians still argue whether Victorian servant training represented humane employment providing opportunity for working-class advancement, or constituted exploitative labour system that demanded superhuman performance under conditions that destroyed health and dignity. What's certain is that Windsor Castle's tea time service required skills that took years to master, physical endurance that excluded those with any weakness or infirmity, and psychological resilience that allowed servants to suppress their own needs entirely while anticipating Victoria's with accuracy that bordered on telepathic. You notice another servant, a maid, young, barely 20 perhaps, whose sole responsibility appears to be maintaining the fire at optimal temperature. She's added coal exactly 4 times during this extended tea time, each addition timed to prevent temperature fluctuation. Too much coal at once and the room becomes uncomfortably hot. Too little and it cools below the sacred 68 degrees. She's learned to read the fire's behaviour, to predict when flames will begin diminishing, to add fuel preemptively rather than reactively. She's been kneeling beside the fireplace for over an hour, inhaling smoke, feeling heat against her face, probably developing the respiratory problems and premature aging that characterise servants who work near fires for years. They wear white gloves for food preparation, Victoria mentions, but change them constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times during the preparation of single tea time service. Any stain, any mark, any suggestion that human hands have touched food creates contamination risk in their minds, or rather, in Mrs. Farley's mind, she enforces these standards with severity that some consider excessive. I've had servants resign over her white glove tyranny, claiming the constant changing wastes expensive gloves and implies distrust of their cleanliness. Mrs. Farley remains unmoved. Perfection requires sacrifice, she claims, and if servants cannot maintain absolute hygiene standards, they should seek employment elsewhere. The choreography includes elements you're only now detecting. The servant who brought the fresh tea napkin earlier didn't simply place it. He positioned it with folded edge facing precisely toward Victoria's right hand, facilitating easy grasping without requiring her to adjust or search. The footman who cleared her bread plate didn't just remove it. He noted exactly how many pieces she'd consumed. Information that gets recorded in kitchen logs, tracking her consumption patterns across weeks and months. Data that helps predict future needs and identify concerning changes in appetite that might indicate health problems requiring physician attention. Every action contains multiple purposes. Every gesture communicates information. Every moment of this tea time generates data that flows back to the domestic machinery managing Victoria's existence. The silence is the hardest part for them, Victoria observes, and there's sympathy in her voice now. Rare acknowledgement that service requires costs beyond labour. They cannot speak except when directly addressed, cannot cough or sneeze or make any sound that would disturb my tea's tranquillity. I've had servants develop elaborate suppression techniques swallowing coughs, breathing through mouths to prevent nasal sounds, even learning to walk differently so their footsteps don't register. One footman told me years after retiring that he used to practice walking on carpets at home, perfecting the silent glide that service demanded. His family thought him insane, watching him pace their cottage in absolute silence. But he understood that his employment depended on becoming human ghost. You watch the maid at the fireplace add another piece of coal, her 5th edition, executed with precision that prevents even the slight clinking sound that coal pieces make when they contact each other. She has mastered the art of silent fuel addition, Probably through thousands of practice sessions, probably through being reprimanded when she failed, probably through the grinding repetition that transforms conscious effort into unconscious competence. She's been trained like Victoria's horses, conditioned through reward and correction until desired behaviour becomes automatic, until suppressing natural human sounds and movements requires no more conscious thought than breathing. Mrs. Farley runs drills, Victoria admits, and there's something like embarrassment in this confession. Actual timed drills where servants practice the entire tea time sequence, racing against clocks to ensure every element arrives on schedule. She sets up my drawing room in the servants' quarters, positions a chair where mine sits, and makes them perform the complete service while she observes with stopwatch and clipboard, noting every second of delay, every minor deviation from protocol. The servants hate it, call it theatrical and excessive, but Mrs. Farley insists that perfection emerges only through relentless practice. She's probably right, though I sometimes wonder what Albert would think about such military precision applied to my afternoon tea. The servants' uniforms tell their own stories pressed to razor-edge sharpness. Starch so stiff they probably chafe against skin, maintained in condition that suggests they're replaced frequently rather than worn until actual deterioration occurs. The fabric quality exceeds what most middle-class people wear on their finest occasions, yet these are work clothes, garments that get soiled and stained and must withstand daily labour. The contradiction captures something essential about Victorian service servants dress better than their social equals because they're representing their employers, because Victoria's household staff must reflect her standards, because shabby servants suggest shabby employers regardless of actual financial status. They're paid reasonably well, Victoria says, perhaps sensing your growing discomfort with the exploitation you're witnessing. Better than factory workers, certainly. Better than most agricultural labourers, with room and board included so their wages represent actual savings rather than mere survival funds. Several of my long-term servants have retired with enough saved to purchase small cottages, to live independently without requiring workhouse charity. The work is demanding, yes, but the compensation exceeds most available alternatives for people of their class. I'm not defending the system exactly. Albert had concerns about service arrangements that I'm only beginning to understand years after his death, but I want you to know that they're not quite slaves, not quite exploited in the ways that factory children are exploited. But watching the footman who's been standing motionless for over an hour, watching the maid who's been kneeling by the fire inhaling smoke, watching the parade of servants who've appeared and disappeared carrying dishes and pots and implements, you're not entirely convinced by Victoria's rationalizations. Yes, they're paid. Yes, they have security. Yes, they eat regularly and sleep in warm beds and won't die of exposure or starvation. But they've traded their bodies and time and health for wages that let them survive. They've suppressed natural behaviours and needs to satisfy arbitrary standards set by people who've never had to suppress anything. They've become extensions of their employer's will rather than independent humans with agency and choice. I couldn't function without them, Victoria admits quietly, and this might be the most honest thing she's said all afternoon. Not just practically, obviously, I couldn't prepare my own tea, manage my own household, coordinate all the elements that make my life possible. But psychologically, I couldn't function without knowing that this structure exists, that these people are maintaining order, that when I enter this room at 4 o'clock, everything will be exactly as it should be. The predictability they provide, the consistency they maintain, that's what allows me to continue governing, to fulfill my duties, to survive the grief that would otherwise consume me. They're not just servants, They're the structure holding me together when I'd otherwise collapse. The servants continue their silent ballet around you, and you see them differently now, not as background furniture, but as highly trained specialists performing work that most people couldn't manage. That requires talents and discipline and sacrifice that goes largely unacknowledged because invisibility defines success in their profession. The best servants are the ones you don't notice, the ones who anticipate needs before they are articulated, the ones who make complex orchestration appear effortless. And here they are, making Victoria's tea time appear simple and natural when it actually requires coordinated effort from 8 people working in perfect synchronization to deliver 23 minutes of seamless service that Victoria has consumed without conscious awareness of the machinery enabling it. The clock shows 4:53, and you sense tea time is approaching conclusion. Soon, Victoria will make her dismissal gesture, and the servants will begin the reverse choreography clearing dishes, banking the fire, returning furniture to its neutral positions, erasing all evidence that tea was taken here today. And tomorrow at 3:30 they'll begin again, performing the same ballet with the same precision, maintaining the structure that keeps Victoria functional and the empire running and all the complicated machinery of Victorian life operating with the smoothness that depends entirely on people whose names history will never record, and whose labour will be remembered only through indirect evidence in household accounts and service logs that no one except specialists will ever read. You notice something has changed in the room's atmosphere. The light has dimmed further. The fire has been allowed to burn slightly lower, and Victoria's posture has shifted into something that suggests both completion and the weight of what this afternoon ritual commemorates rather than celebrates. The clock reads 5:04, just past the hour when tea time normally concludes. But Victoria hasn't dismissed the servants yet, hasn't risen from her chair, hasn't signalled that this daily ceremony has reached its end. Instead, she's staring at the empty chair positioned precisely across from hers, the chair that's been there throughout this entire afternoon, but that you've been politely ignoring because its significance seemed too private to acknowledge directly. This is morning tea after Albert, and you're about to understand how grief transformed Victoria's most intimate ritual into something between memorial service and daily penance. "That was Albert's chair," Victoria says unnecessarily. "You deduced this already from its position, from the way she's been occasionally glancing toward it throughout tea time, from the fact that no servant has approached it or adjusted it despite it being slightly crooked, as though its positioning represents sacred geometry that cannot be altered without violating something essential." He sat there every afternoon we took tea together, 19 years of afternoons, minus time spent travelling separately or when one of us was ill, thousands of tea times across our marriage, and then suddenly none. The chair remains because I cannot bear to remove it, cannot acknowledge that finality, cannot accept that tomorrow and every day afterward he won't be sitting there complaining gently about my excessive sugar consumption, or reading me passages from whatever German philosophy he's currently obsessed with. The chair itself looks ordinary, upholstered in fabric that matches Victoria's chair, positioned at conversational distance, showing no visible signs of its inhabitant's 9-year absence. But you notice now that a teacup sits on the small table beside it, that this cup has been filled though no one has drunk from it, that steam rises from its surface exactly as it does from Victoria's own cup. Someone misses. Farley, probably following Victoria's unstated instructions, has prepared tea for Albert, as though he might arrive any moment, as though death represents temporary absence rather than permanent departure, as though serving his preferred blend with his exact specifications might somehow summon him back through the sheer force of routine maintained. I serve his favourites every day, Victoria continues, her voice carrying the flat quality of someone reciting facts too painful to inflect with emotion. The salmon sandwiches he preferred, the Dundee cake that reminded him of Scotland, tea with exactly 1 sugar cube and half a lemon slice. The portions sit untouched for the hour, and then servants clear them away, probably feeding them to the dogs or disposing of them somehow. Wasteful, certainly. Possibly insane. But I cannot stop. Cannot accept tea time without Albert's portion prepared. Cannot acknowledge that his appetite ended when his body failed. Cannot move forward into a reality where I take tea alone rather than together. Historians still argue whether Victoria's refusal to remove Albert's chair and continued service of his portions represented healthy grief processing or pathological inability to accept loss. Some suggest the ritual provided necessary continuity that allowed Victoria to continue functioning during early widowhood, when many thought she might abdicate or withdraw entirely from public life. Others claim it prevented healthy grief progression, kept her locked in denial that made moving forward impossible, contributed to the extended mourning that scandalised Britain and damaged her political effectiveness. What's certain is that 9 years after Albert's death, she still serves his tea, still maintains his space, still performs this daily ritual that acknowledges absence by refusing to accept it. You watch Victoria lift her cup and make a small gesture toward Albert's empty chair, as though toasting an invisible companion or acknowledging his continued presence despite physical absence. I tell him about my day, she admits, and there's defiance in her voice now, anticipation that you'll judge this behaviour as evidence of instability or excessive grief. Not allowed. I'm not mad enough to speak to empty chairs where servants can hear. But silently, internally, I report what's happened, what decisions I've made, what concerns require his counsel, even though he cannot provide it. Sometimes I can almost hear his responses, can predict what he'd say with accuracy born from 19 years of knowing his mind as well as my own. Whether those predicted responses constitute genuine spiritual communion, or merely my imagination projecting familiar patterns onto silence, I cannot say and don't particularly care. The food prepared for Albert sits untouched on his side table, 2 salmon sandwiches, a slice of Dundee cake, his preferred tea mixture prepared exactly as he liked it. The sandwiches will have grown soggy by now, the cake slightly stale from exposure to air, the tea cooling toward room temperature where it will taste flat and bitter. All of it wasted, all of it prepared with the same care and precision that Victoria's actual consumed food receives, all of it disposed of hours from now without ever fulfilling its intended purpose. The servants must find this ritual strange or sad or pointless, but they execute it without question because that's what service demands, performing requested tasks regardless of logic or emotional stability. The first tea time after Albert died was unbearable, Victoria says, and you hear her voice thickening with tears she's fighting to suppress. I couldn't enter this room for weeks. The thought of sitting here without him, of consuming tea and sandwiches and cake while he lay dead in his tomb, it felt obscene somehow. Felt like betrayal. Felt like admitting life continued when life had actually ended with his final breath. My household worried I'd starve, urged me to take meals anywhere, even if not the drawing room. Eventually my physician insisted, actually ordered me to resume taking tea, claiming my health required regular eating and that breaking routine entirely would damage me beyond repair. The first morning tea time happened approximately 6 weeks after Albert's death, and Victoria describes it with clarity that suggests the memory remains vivid despite 9 years' passage. She'd entered the room to find everything arranged exactly as always: her chair, his chair, the tea service, the food selections they'd always shared, except Albert wasn't there. would never be there again. And the empty chair mocked her with its vacancy. She'd lasted perhaps 15 minutes before fleeing in tears, leaving her tea cold and food untouched, unable to tolerate the absence that the familiar ritual made unbearably concrete. But I kept trying, Victoria continues, because Albert would have wanted me to maintain routines, would have disapproved of my surrendering to grief so completely that I abandoned daily structures he'd worked to establish. He believed in discipline, in continuing forward even when circumstances made stopping seem preferable. So I forced myself to return the next day, and the next, and gradually it became bearable. Not pleasant, it's never been pleasant since his death, but bearable. The ritual provides structure when everything else feels chaotic, provides continuity when change threatens to overwhelm me, provides the illusion that some things remain constant, even when the most important thing has been permanently altered. You notice that Victoria's mourning dress, black silk without ornamentation except Albert's hair brooch, has become so habitual that you'd stopped consciously registering it. She's worn black for 9 years now. Will wear it for the remaining 30 years of her life, transforming temporary mourning into permanent identity. The dress itself represents her refusal to accept that grieving should have endpoints, that society's arbitrary timelines for appropriate mourning deserve her compliance, that she should move on as physicians and ministers and family members continuously urge her to do. The black dress announces daily that she remains a widow, that Albert's death constitutes her defining characteristic more than 33 years of reigning does. People think I'm excessive, Victoria says, anticipating your judgment again. They whisper that 9 years is too long, that Albert would want me to be happy rather than perpetually mourning, that I'm indulging grief rather than processing it healthily. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps serving tea to an empty chair does constitute madness, does suggest I've failed to accept reality, does indicate emotional dysfunction requiring intervention. But what they don't understand, what no one who hasn't lost their person can understand, is that this ritual isn't about Albert being dead. It's about Albert having existed at all, about honouring that he lived and loved me and shared 19 years of afternoons in this room. Stopping the ritual would erase him more completely than death already has. The servants remain motionless throughout Victoria's explanation. And you wonder what they think about this daily performance they're required to facilitate. Do they pity her, judge her, feel uncomfortable participating in what might be extended delusion? Or have they simply accepted that this is part of their duties? No stranger than the elaborate choreography around tea temperature or the ridiculous precision required for sandwich cutting. Service demands suppressing personal opinions about employer behaviour, requires maintaining neutrality about actions that might seem bizarre or excessive, obligates performing requested tasks without questioning their psychological implications or emotional sustainability. Sometimes I imagine he's just late, Victoria admits quietly, and this might be the most heartbreaking thing she's shared all afternoon, that he's been delayed by some ministerial meeting or estate business, that he'll arrive any moment apologising for his tardiness while I scold him gently about letting tea grow cold. The fantasy lasts perhaps 30 seconds before reality reasserts itself, before I remember that he's not late but gone, that no amount of waiting will bring him through that door, that the only arrival I'm expecting is my own death when we'll finally be reunited. Morbid, perhaps, but honest. I'm not living anymore. Not really. I'm just waiting, maintaining routines that mark time between now and when we're together again. You watch the clock advance toward 5:15, and you understand that Victoria will sit here for the full hour she always takes, maintaining the structure that Albert established. honouring the routine they created together, even though she now performs it alone. The untouched tea and food on Albert's side table represent her refusal to accept absence, her insistence on maintaining space for someone who cannot occupy it, her determination that death won't erase the rituals that defined their partnership and gave meaning to her days. "I know this seems pathological," Victoria says, as though reading your thoughts. "I know healthy grief supposedly involves acceptance, moving forward, reconstructing life around loss rather than letting loss define everything. But I'm not interested in healthy grief. I'm interested in maintaining connection to the person I loved most, the person whose absence has left me fundamentally diminished, the person whose death transformed me into someone I barely recognize but whom I'm determined to honour through daily remembrance rather than convenient forgetting disguised as healing. The servants will clear both settings soon, Victoria's consumed items and Albert's untouched portions, treating them with equal care and attention, because that's what the ritual demands. Tomorrow at 3:30 they'll begin the preparation again, setting up 2 chairs and 2 portions and 2 cups of tea precisely prepared, despite knowing that only one will be consumed. And Victoria will enter at 4 o'clock and spend her hour in conversation with absence, maintained through the only language she has left, food and tea, and the stubborn insistence that some things survive even death, even when evidence suggests otherwise, even when the entire world encourages her to abandon rituals they consider excessive and embrace a grief that concludes rather than continuing indefinitely. The empty chair sits across from her, and in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon it almost looks occupied, almost suggests presence rather than vacancy, almost, but not quite. And Victoria continues her vigil, her daily devotion to memory and loss and the man who's been gone 9 years but whom she refuses to relinquish, whom she keeps present through tea service and conversation, and the radical act of refusing to accept that his portion of life concluded when his body failed. Morning tea after Albert, not a ritual designed to help her heal, but rather one intended to prevent healing, to keep grief fresh, to maintain loss as living presence rather than fading memory, excessive perhaps, unhealthy certainly, but utterly, devastatingly human. You notice the clock approaching 5:30 now, and Victoria's tea time, this extended afternoon ceremony you've witnessed in all its complexity and contradiction, is finally drawing toward conclusion. But the story doesn't end here, in this Windsor drawing room in 1870, and Victoria knows it, even if she cannot see the future clearly. What she's created during these private hours will outlive her by decades, will spread across continents and social classes, will transform from personal ritual into cultural institution that defines British identity for generations who never knew the grief and longing that inspired it. This is the legacy of Victoria's tea time, and you're beginning to understand that what seemed like simple afternoon refreshment actually represents something far larger, the creation of tradition itself. The moment when personal habit becomes national practice, when one woman's preferences shape millions of lives across an empire and beyond. "People are copying me already," Victoria mentions, and there's something between satisfaction and discomfort in her acknowledgement. Middle-class families in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, they're serving afternoon tea at 4 o'clock precisely, arranging 3-tiered stands with sandwiches and scones, purchasing special porcelain services dedicated exclusively to tea. They're performing their own versions of what I do here privately, transforming my personal ritual into social theatre. Some do it from genuine appreciation for the custom. Others do it to demonstrate status, to prove they possess leisure time and resources for afternoon meals that serve no nutritional purpose beyond displaying refinement. Either way, they're spreading the practice, making afternoon tea into something definitively British rather than just Victoria's peculiarity. The phenomenon accelerated after Albert's death. Ironically, Victoria's retreat from public life created fascination with her private habits, and afternoon tea became the visible ritual that middle-class families could emulate despite lacking access to other aspects of royal existence. You cannot live in Balmoral or Windsor, cannot wear crowns or govern empires, but you can serve tea at 4 o'clock with proper sandwiches and scones, can purchase porcelain painted with designs claiming royal approval, can perform your own version of rituals that connect you imaginatively to the distant queen whose grief has somehow made her more relatable than her power ever did. Shared tea time practices create the illusion of shared experience with Victoria, democratizing royal ritual in ways that actually reinforce rather than challenge class hierarchies. The tea merchants have been extraordinarily clever, Victoria continues, and you detect admiration mixed with cynicism in her observation. They've created royal blend teas that claim to replicate my personal mixture. Though obviously they don't have access to the actual formula, they've marketed Windsor service porcelain sets that supposedly match my preferences. They've published guides explaining proper afternoon tea etiquette that cite royal standards I've never actually articulated. They're building commercial empires on my consumption habits, making fortunes from my afternoon preferences, and I receive nothing except the dubious satisfaction of knowing my tea time has inspired an entire industry. Historians still argue whether Victorian afternoon tea represented genuine cultural evolution or manufactured tradition, something that felt ancient and authentic, but actually emerged quite recently through combination of commercial interests, royal influence, and middle-class aspiration toward respectability the tea's elaborate rituals conveniently displayed. What's certain is that by 1870 afternoon, tea has become sufficiently established that most practitioners cannot remember life without it, cannot imagine British identity divorced from this practice that Victoria didn't invent, but certainly popularised through her obsessive daily performance of it. The practice has spread beyond Britain's shores already. You're learning, travelling with colonial administrators and military personnel to India, Australia, Canada, and other territories where British influence requires visible performance, in Calcutta and Melbourne and Toronto. British expatriates serve afternoon tea at 4 o'clock precisely, using porcelain imported from England, consuming foods that approximate British standards despite local climate making hot tea and butter-heavy foods somewhat absurd. The ritual becomes colonialism made edible, becomes way of maintaining British identity in foreign contexts, becomes assertion that civilization defined as British civilization can be preserved anywhere through sufficient commitment to proper tea time practices. I received a letter from a missionary in India, Victoria mentions, describing how she serves afternoon tea to native women, teaching them proper sandwich cutting and scone consumption as part of their Christianization and civilization. She seemed to think tea service and salvation were equivalent endeavours, that learning to hold teacups properly represented spiritual progress equal to accepting scripture. I found it disturbing, honestly, this assumption that my afternoon habits constitute universal standards that colonised peoples should adopt, that British tea rituals deserve imposition on cultures with their own tea traditions spanning millennia. But I didn't respond, didn't know how to articulate discomfort without seeming to question the entire colonial project that my government pursues. You're watching Victoria grapple with realisation that her personal preferences have escaped her control, have been weaponised by commercial interests and colonial administrators in ways she never intended, have become tools for enforcing conformity and displaying dominance rather than simply providing comfort during difficult afternoons. The legacy she is creating isn't entirely positive alongside genuine cultural enrichment and creation of pleasant social rituals. Afternoon tea has become a mechanism for class distinction, colonial imposition, and the kind of rigid etiquette that excludes more than it includes, that judges people's worth based on sandwich cutting technique and proper milk pouring order. After I die, Victoria says, returning to her favourite speculation about posthumous existence, afternoon tea will probably continue evolving in directions I wouldn't recognise or approve. It will become more elaborate or more simplified, more exclusive or more democratic, more British or more international. The practice will drift away from whatever authentic origins it possessed, which weren't that authentic anyway, given that I borrowed elements from various sources and combined them according to personal preference rather than historical precedent. Eventually people will serve traditional British afternoon tea that bears minimal resemblance to what I actually consume here, but they'll claim their version represents authentic royal practice because that marketing claim sells products and admits customers to establishments charging premium prices for participation in imagined tradition. The servants begin subtle movements that signal tea time's conclusion. The firemaid banks coals for evening rather than maintaining afternoon temperature. The footman shifts position slightly after standing motionless for nearly 90 minutes. Misses. Farley herself appears in the doorway ready to supervise the clearing process and receive Victoria's feedback about today's service. The machinery that created this elaborate ritual prepares to disassemble it, to clean and store and ready everything for tomorrow's repetition, continuing the cycle that will persist until Victoria's death and probably long afterward, as succeeding monarchs maintain practices that have become too established to abandon without seeming to reject British identity itself. I hope people remember that this was never about the food, Victoria says quietly, standing now with the slight effort that accompanies her increasing age and weight. It was about creating structure when everything else felt chaotic, about honouring Albert's memory through daily ritual, about maintaining connection to happiness I experienced before loss transformed me into this perpetually grieving woman who wears black and serves tea to empty chairs. The sandwiches and scones and cake were just vehicles for something larger, for memory and love, and the stubborn refusal to let death erase the rituals that defined the best years of my life. You watch her move toward the door, leaving behind the tea service and empty plates and Albert's untouched portion that servants will clear away before dinner preparation begins. The room will be restored to its neutral state, all evidence of tea time removed, leaving it ready for tomorrow when the cycle begins again at 3:30 with room preparation and continues through 4 o'clock service until 5:30 dismissal. Day after day, year after year, until Victoria's own death in 1901 ends her personal performance of this ritual, though the cultural practice she's established will persist for decades afterward, will survive 2 world wars and the empire's dissolution, will remain recognisable even in the 21st century when people still serve afternoon tea and claim connection to Victorian tradition despite practising versions that Victoria herself wouldn't quite recognise. "Thank you for joining me," Victoria says, "acknowledging your presence in this impossible afternoon where you've witnessed what few outsiders ever saw the private ritual behind the public practice. The grief underlying the elaborate etiquette, the human needs that formal structures attempt to address and occasionally succeed in satisfying. You've seen what I actually ate during my private afternoon tea. Not the mythological version that guidebooks describe, not the sanitized royal ritual that middle-class families emulate, But the real thing, sandwiches and scones and cake and tea, consumed while missing my dead husband and trying to maintain routines that make continued living bearable when the person I most want to share them with is 9 years gone. She pauses at the doorway, looking back at the 2 chairs, hers and Albert's, that will remain positioned exactly here until tomorrow's tea time requires them again. People will remember the food and the etiquette and the elaborate rituals, she says, almost to herself. They'll forget that it was about loss and memory and daily grief management disguised as refined social practice. They'll serve their own afternoon teas and think they're participating in gracious British tradition, never understanding that they're actually performing morning rituals that a widowed queen created because she couldn't figure out how else to survive afternoons that her husband's death had rendered unbearable. But perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps traditions serve their purpose regardless of whether practitioners understand their origins. Perhaps my private grief has accidentally created something larger than itself. Something that will outlive me and serve purposes I never imagined during these sad afternoons, when I ate my sandwiches and drank my tea and desperately wished that the empty chair across from me might miraculously, impossibly fill. And with that, Victoria exits the drawing room, leaving you alone with the servants who begin their efficient clearing process, removing evidence of the ritual you've witnessed. Outside, the sun continues setting over Windsor's grounds, and across Britain and beyond. Thousands of families are likely serving their own afternoon teas right now, performing their versions of the practice Victoria has made fashionable, creating their own memories and traditions around foods and rituals that originated here in this room with this grieving woman who transformed personal necessity into cultural legacy. The 3-tiered stands and porcelain services and precise schedules will endure, will define British identity for generations, will represent civilization and refinement and class distinction and all the complicated meanings that humans invest in the simple act of consuming tea and small foods at 4 o'clock at an afternoon when work has paused and evening has not yet begun. Victoria's private tea time has become Britain's shared inheritance. And the world will never quite understand that what they're celebrating emerged from grief rather than joy, from desperate need for structure rather than aristocratic leisure, from one woman's inability to accept her husband's death rather than from any particular culinary genius or social innovation. The legacy persists regardless, spreading across continents and centuries, proving that sometimes the most enduring traditions emerge not from careful planning but from private rituals that accidentally escape their original context and take on lives of their own, serving purposes their creators never imagined and probably wouldn't entirely approve, but persisting nonetheless because humans need traditions and rituals and daily practices that connect them to something larger than individual existence, even when those traditions originated in circumstances far removed from the meanings later generations assign to them. The room empties, the servants depart, the fire dims to embers, and tomorrow at 3:30, the entire process will begin again. The afternoon light has faded now to that soft purple twilight that makes everything feel distant and dreamlike, and you feel your own consciousness beginning to drift along with it. Victoria has shown you everything, the simple bread and butter that shocked aristocrats, the weekly Dundee cake travelling 500 miles from Scottish longing, the finger sandwiches governed by geometric obsession, the tea blend created specifically for her palate, the sugar cubes that physicians condemned, the scones and crumpets whose rivalry entertained her, the jam and cream that sparked regional politics, the biscuit tin holding edible mood documentation, the milk and lemon choices that revealed her emotional weather, the 47 porcelain services representing relationships frozen in ceramic, the invisible servant ballet making everything appear effortless, the morning tea served to Albert's empty chair, and finally the legacy spreading across an empire and beyond, But none of this was really about the food, was it? It was about a woman trying to survive loss by creating structure, by maintaining rituals, by insisting that some things remain constant even when the most important thing had been permanently taken from her. It was about grief management disguised as refined social practice, about love expressed through daily commemoration, about refusing to let death erase the patterns that had defined her happiest years. As you drift towards sleep now, let those images soften and blur the steam rising from porcelain cups, the afternoon light through lace curtains, the empty chair waiting eternally for its absent occupant, the servants moving in their silent ballet, the three-tiered stands holding foods that were never really about sustenance, but about memory and meaning, and the small daily acts that make impossible situations slightly more bearable. Let it all fade into comfortable darkness. Let the details dissolve into gentle abstraction. Let yourself release the specific facts and retain only the feeling, that sense of something both sad and beautiful, both excessive and deeply human, both peculiar to one woman and somehow universal in its recognition that we all need rituals and routines and small daily pleasures to carry us through the losses that life inevitably inflicts. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere in history, Victoria is still taking her afternoon tea, still serving salmon sandwiches to an empty chair, still maintaining her stubborn vigil against forgetting, still performing her daily ritual that became a legacy that outlived her by generations. The story continues even as you release it, even as consciousness fades and the details become less distinct and finally disappear into the welcoming darkness of deep, peaceful, undisturbed sleep